Owen Mercer never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to pull teeth and stay alive. But when a mysterious woman dragged him into a frontier marriage at gunpoint, survival became something else entirely. She promised protection. She lied about everything. And when the bullets started flying on a cursed wagon train heading straight into hell, Owen discovered that the West doesn't care about your plans. It only cares if you're fast enough to stay breathing. This is the story of the weakest man who became the West's most dangerous secret. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Owen Mercer's skull cracked against the window frame for the third time in an hour. He pressed his handkerchief to his temple, checking for blood that wasn't there, while the man across from him, a leather-faced rancher with tobacco juice staining his beard, let out a wet laugh. "City boy," the rancher said, though it wasn't quite a question. Owen managed a tight smile. "Dentist, actually, from Philadelphia." "Same damn thing out here," the rancher spat into a tin cup wedged between his boots. "What brings a tooth puller to Colorado territory?" "Opportunity," Owen said, though the word felt hollow even as it left his mouth. "The frontier needs skilled professionals, men of science, and what it needs," the rancher interrupted, "is men who can shoot straight and shut up when told. Everything else is decoration." Owen fell silent, turning back to the window where the landscape rolled past in shades of brown and gray. The green hills of home had given way to something harder, meaner. Out here, even the dirt looked angry. He'd been traveling for 3 weeks, each mile carrying him further from everything he understood. His mother had cried at the train station. His father had shaken his hand with the grim expression of a man watching his son walk into a furnace. His former fiancée, had returned his letters unopened after he'd announced his plans. "You're running away," she'd written in her final note. "From responsibility, from family, from me. Don't pretend this is about opportunity. You're just too scared to be ordinary." Maybe she was right. Maybe that's exactly what he was doing. But sitting in that Philadelphia parlor, watching his future narrow into the same cramped dental practice his father had operated for 30 years, the same Sunday dinners with the same people discussing the same gossip, it had felt like suffocating in slow motion. The frontier promised something different, something bigger. The advertisements in the Eastern papers made it sound like paradise. Young men of ambition sought for the expanding West. Fortunes to be made. Futures to be built. What they didn't mention was how the land itself seemed designed to kill you. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside what the driver optimistically called Salvation Creek, though Owen saw no creek and considerable doubt about salvation. The town consisted of maybe 20 buildings scattered along a dirt road that turned to soup when it rained. Most structures leaned at angles that would have horrified a Philadelphia building inspector. "End of the line," the driver called down. "Unless you're fool enough to go further." Owen gathered his bags, 2 large trunks containing his dental equipment, a smaller case with his clothes, and a leather satchel holding his life savings, $400 in crisp bills that felt increasingly worthless the further west he traveled. The moment his boots hit the dirt, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. The street was a carnival of chaos. Cowboys shouted at each other in languages Owen couldn't identify. A woman in a dress that would have caused riots back east leaned against a saloon doorway, smoking a cigarette with the casual confidence of someone who'd forgotten shame existed. 2 men were fighting in the mud outside the general store, while a small crowd placed bets on the outcome. Nobody looked at Owen. Nobody cared. He hefted his bags and started toward the only building that looked remotely professional, a 2-story structure with a faded sign reading Merchants Exchange and Boarding. "You lost, son?" The voice came from behind him. Owen turned to find a man in a dusty suit and bowler hat, his smile too wide and too white for this gray town. He had the kind of face that looked friendly at first glance and predatory at second. "Just arrived," Owen said, "looking for the boarding house." "You found it." "Name's Walter Pitch." The man extended his hand. "Trader, merchant, and friend to newcomers. What brings you to our little paradise?" "I'm a dentist, Dr. Owen Mercer." He shook the offered hand, trying to match the man's grip and failing. "I'm planning to establish a practice here." Pitch's eyebrows rose. "A dentist? Well, I'll be." That's exactly what this town needs. He clapped Owen on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. Come on, let me help you with those bags. We'll get you settled, and I'll tell you everything you need to know about making it out here. Owen should have been more careful. He should have recognized the eagerness in Pitch's voice, the way the man's eyes kept flicking to the money satchel. He should have remembered his father's warning. Anyone who's too friendly too fast is usually after something. But Owen was exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperately grateful for a kind word in this hostile place. So he let Walter Pitch take his bags. He followed him into the boarding house. He sat at a corner table while Pitch ordered whiskey and started talking. Thing you need to understand, Pitch said, pouring drinks with the authority of a man who owned the bottle, is that the frontier operates on different rules. Back east, you got laws and courts and all that civilized nonsense. Out here, a man's reputation is his currency. You want to make it? You need to establish yourself quick. I have excellent credentials, Owen said. Top of my class at Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery. I've studied the latest techniques in... Nobody cares about credentials, son. Pitch leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. They care about confidence, presence, the look of a man who belongs. Owen glanced down at his travel-stained suit, his thin arms, his soft hands that had never done anything rougher than pull a stubborn molar. I'm not sure I have that look. That's where I come in. Pitch grinned. See, I help newcomers establish themselves. Get the right equipment, the right location, the right introduction to the right people. For a small fee, of course. I have my equipment, Owen said, gesturing to his trunks. My dental tools are top quality. I spent months. Tooth-pulling stuff, sure. But what about the other necessities? A gun, for instance. Can't practice dentistry if you're dead. Owen's stomach tightened. I don't know how to use a gun. Then you better learn or buy protection. Which brings me to my second point, location. You can't just set up anywhere. You need the right spot, but all the good buildings are spoken for. Unless... He paused dramatically. Unless you know someone who can arrange things. And you can arrange things? For the right price, I can arrange anything. Over the next hour, Pitch painted a picture of the frontier so terrifying and expensive that Owen felt his savings evaporating before his eyes. He needed a gun, $50. He needed protection, $100 a month. He needed the prime building on Main Street, $200 deposit. He needed introductions to the town's influential citizens, $50 per introduction. By the time the bottle was empty and Pitch's smile had grown wider, Owen had agreed to part with $375, nearly everything he had, for a package of services that would establish him as Salvation Creek's premier dentist. One last thing, Pitch said, standing. The gun. I've got a real beauty in my shop, a Colt .45 barely used. Came off a gentleman who, sadly, no longer needs it. Yours for $50, and I'll throw in a quick lesson on how to load it. Owen's hand trembled as he counted out the bills. This was insane. He was being robbed in slow motion, and some part of him knew it, but the alternative, walking away with nothing arranged, no protection, no plan, felt even worse. Pleasure doing business, Dr. Mercer. Pitch pocketed the money with the smooth efficiency of long practice. I'll have everything arranged by tomorrow. You get some rest, and welcome to the West. He was gone before Owen could change his mind, leaving behind an empty whiskey bottle and a sick feeling in Owen's gut that intensified when the bartender appeared. That'll be $2 for the whiskey and table rental. But Mr. Pitch ordered, and you drank it, $2. Owen paid, went upstairs to the cramped room that smelled of mildew and mouse droppings, and sat on the edge of the sagging bed with his head in his hands. 3 days in the West, and he'd already lost almost everything. The knock came at dawn, and it wasn't gentle. Mercer, open up! Owen stumbled to the door in his nightshirt, finding a deputy with a star pinned crookedly on his vest and an expression of profound irritation. You the dentist who paid Walter Pitch yesterday? Yes, Then you're an idiot. Walter Pitch ain't a merchant. He's a con man who's been working this route for 3 years. He took your money and left on the midnight stage. The words hit Owen like cold water. But he promised. He said he'd arrange. He promised you the moon and sold you dirt. That gun he sold you? It's a rusted piece of junk that'll blow your hand off if you try to fire it. The building on Main Street? Already occupied by the land office. The protection? Imaginary. He saw you coming a mile away, son. Owen sat down hard on the bed. What do I... You file a report, which won't do any good because Pitch is gone. You live with being stupid, and you either go home or you figure out how to survive out here without money, protection, or friends. The deputy's voice softened slightly. My advice? Take the next stage east. The frontier eats men like you for breakfast. But going home meant admitting failure. It meant facing his father's disappointment, his mother's tears, his former fiance's smug vindication. It meant 30 years of Pennsylvania winters, and the same cramped parlor, and the slow death of every dream he'd ever had. I'm staying, Owen said quietly. The deputy shrugged. Your funeral. The morning sun was brutal as Owen stood on Main Street with his remaining $25, 2 trunks of dental equipment, and absolutely no idea what to do next. People passed him without looking. A group of cowboys laughed at something, and Owen was certain, absolutely certain, they were laughing at him. You look lost. The voice was female, low and smooth. Owen turned to find a woman watching him from the doorway of the general store. She was probably 30, with dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat and eyes that saw too much. Her dress was practical rather than fancy, and she held herself with the kind of stillness that comes from being very sure of your place in the world. I am lost, Owen admitted, because what was the point of lying? Completely and thoroughly lost. Fresh off the stage? 3 days ago. Let me guess, Walter Pitch? Owen nodded miserably. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. He gets most of the new ones. You're in good company, though that's probably cold comfort. She stepped closer, studying him with an intensity that made Owen want to straighten his spine. Dentist? How did you... The trunks. Saw the labels when you came in yesterday. Also, you have soft hands, and you keep touching your teeth when you're nervous. She extended her hand. Delilah Voss. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Owen Mercer. Well, Dr. Mercer, you've got 2 choices. Spend that $25 on a stage ticket home, or spend it on a bath, a shave, and a meal while you figure out your next move. She tilted her head. Which kind of man are you? The stubborn kind, apparently. Good. Stubborn keeps you alive out here longer than smart. She gestured down the street. There's a wagon train forming up, heading northwest to the mining camps. They leave in 3 days, and they always need a sawbones, even a tooth puller. Pays decent, and it'll get you where the real money is. A wagon train? Unless you want to stay here and compete with old Doc Farley, who's been pulling teeth in Salvation Creek for 20 years and doesn't take kindly to competition. He already knows you're here, by the way. He's the reason the deputy was so helpful this morning. Owen's stomach sank further. He sent the deputy? To scare you off. Did it work? Should it have? Delilah's smile widened, and for the first time since arriving, Owen felt like maybe, possibly, he'd said the right thing. Come on, I'll buy you breakfast and tell you what you need to know about the wagon master. Man's name is Jacob Kane, and he's a hard bastard, but fair. You want on his train, you'll need to look less like a scarecrow and more like someone who won't die in the first week. The bathhouse was a revelation. Hot water, actual soap, and 30 minutes where nobody was trying to rob him, mock him, or explain how he was going to die. Owen emerged feeling almost human, his borrowed razor having done away with 3 days of scraggly beard growth. Delilah was waiting outside with a bundle under her arm. Put these on. The clothes were rough cotton, broken in and practical. Work pants, a heavy shirt, a vest with actual pockets. They fit better than his ruined suit, and when Owen caught his reflection in a store window, he looked different. Not quite frontier tough, but at least not actively comedic. Better, Delilah said, circling him with an appraising eye. Now listen carefully, because I'm only saying this once. Jacob Kane doesn't care about your credentials or your sad story. He cares about 3 things. Can you do the job? Will you follow orders? And are you going to get his people killed? You answer yes to the first 2 and no to the third, you're on the train. Understand? Yes? But why are you... Helping you? Let's just say I appreciate people who don't quit when they should. She started walking toward the edge of town, where the wagon train was taking shape. Also, I need you to do me a favor. Here it comes, Owen thought. The catch, the angle, the moment where kindness turns into another con. I need to be on that wagon train, Delilah continued. But Kane has a rule, no single women. Too much trouble, he says, too much distraction for the men. So unless I can find a husband in the next 3 days, I'm stuck here. Owen stopped walking. You want me to marry me? Yes. She said it like she was discussing the weather. Just for the journey. Once we reach the mining camps, we go our separate ways. You get your fresh start, I get where I need to go. Everyone wins. That's insane. So is staying in Salvation Creek with no money and a target on your back from Doc Farley. She met his eyes. I'm offering you a way forward. Take it or leave it, but decide fast because Kane's leaving with or without us. Owen's mind raced. This was madness. He didn't know this woman. He'd been in the West less than a week and had already been robbed, humiliated, and was now being proposed to by a stranger who probably had 10 different angles he couldn't see. But she was also the only person who'd shown him any genuine help, and going back to Philadelphia felt like dying in slow motion. One condition, Owen heard himself say. You tell me why you really need to get on that train. Delilah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a calculation being made and a decision being reached. I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to be found. That's all you need to know. And when we find this person? We won't. I will. She extended her hand again. So, are we doing this? Owen looked at her hand, at the wagon train being assembled in the distance, at the hostile town behind him, and the impossible frontier ahead. Every rational thought in his mind was screaming at him to say no. He shook her hand. We're doing this. The wedding was performed by a traveling judge who was probably drunk and definitely in a hurry. It took less than 5 minutes, cost $3 Owen didn't have, Delilah paid, and was witnessed by 2 men who looked like they robbed stagecoaches in their spare time. By the authority vested in me by the Colorado Territory, I now pronounce you man and wife. Sign here, here, and here. Congratulations, you're married. Next. Owen stared at the certificate bearing his name next to Delilah Voss, now Delilah Mercer, and felt reality sliding sideways. 24 hours ago, he'd been mourning his lost money. Now he was married to a woman he'd known for 3 hours, committed to a wagon train journey into unknown territory, and holding a marriage license that felt like a ticket to something either very right or catastrophically wrong. Stop looking like you're about to faint, Delilah said, tucking the certificate into her bag. This is the good part. Come on, we need to meet Kane before he fills the last spots. Jacob Kane was exactly the kind of man Owen's mother would have crossed the street to avoid. 6 feet of weathered muscle, scarred hands, and eyes that had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. He ran his gaze over Owen like a buyer evaluating a questionable horse. This your dentist? Kane asked Delilah. My husband, she corrected. Dr. Owen Mercer, best tooth puller in Philadelphia. Don't care where he's from, can he work? He can, Delilah said before Owen could answer. Kane grunted. You understand what you're signing up for, dentist. 6 weeks of hard travel through hostile territory. We'll be crossing land where the locals don't take kindly to settlers. We'll have raiders, weather, accidents, and about 100 ways to die before we see the mining camps. You ready for that? Owen wanted to say no. He wanted to explain that he'd never been ready for anything in his life, that he fainted at the sight of his own blood, that the roughest thing he'd ever endured was a cold Philadelphia winter. Instead, he heard himself say, I'm ready. Kane studied him for another long moment, then nodded. $200. That covers your wagon space, provisions, and protection. You'll travel with the Hendersons, family of 5 heading to stake a claim. You'll help with their medical needs, general camp work, and whatever else needs doing. Questions? I don't have $200. Then you don't have a spot. Delilah stepped forward. I have it. Both men turned to stare at her. She pulled a leather purse from her bag and counted out 20 gold eagles with the casual confidence of someone who handled money regularly. Kane took the coins, tested one between his teeth, and pocketed them. You're on the train. We leave at first light 3 days from now. Don't be late, don't bring trouble, and don't make me regret this." He turned to walk away, then paused. "One more thing, dentist. Your wife just bought your way onto this train, which means you owe her. Out here, a debt like that is serious business. You understand?" "I understand," Owen said, though he was starting to suspect he understood nothing at all. That night, Owen lay awake in the boarding house room he now shared with his wife of 6 hours, listening to her breathe in the darkness. She'd insisted on separate beds. "This is business, not romance," she'd said, and had fallen asleep within minutes of lying down. Owen stared at the ceiling and tried to process the complete demolition of his life plan. He was married, he was broke, he was committed to a journey that would probably kill him. And the woman sleeping 3 feet away was a complete mystery, who'd just spent $200 to buy him a future he wasn't sure he wanted. "Stop thinking so loud," Delilah said from the darkness. "You're going to give yourself a headache. You're not asleep?" "I'm never really asleep." "Habit." Cloth rustled as she shifted. "You're wondering what you've gotten yourself into, among other things." "Fair question. Here's the answer. You've gotten yourself into a chance, maybe your last one. The frontier doesn't care about your past or your mistakes. It only cares what you do next. So tomorrow, you start doing things that don't end with you getting robbed or married to strangers. You're a stranger too." "True, but I'm a stranger who needs you alive and useful, which makes me the best friend you've got out here." She paused. "Get some sleep, Owen. The real work starts soon." But sleep wouldn't come. Owen's mind kept circling back to Delilah's words during their brief private conversation after the wedding. "I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to be found." Who was she looking for? And what would happen when she found them? The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that exposed every gap in Owen's frontier education. He didn't know how to pack a wagon properly, tie the knots that would hold through rough terrain, or judge the quality of trail provisions. The Henderson family, a weathered father named Tom, his tired wife Sarah, and 3 children ranging from 6 to 14, watched his fumbling efforts with patient amusement. "First time west of the Mississippi?" Tom asked, as Owen struggled with a rope that had somehow become more tangled the more he worked with it. "First time west of Philadelphia." "Shows. Here." Tom took the rope and demonstrated the proper technique with the casual competence of a man who'd been doing this since childhood. "You'll learn. Everyone does, or they don't make it. No shame in being green, only in staying stupid." Delilah, meanwhile, moved through preparations with an efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first wagon train. She checked supplies with the eye of someone who knew exactly what would be needed and what was dead weight. She spoke with the other families, learning names and dynamics, mapping the social terrain. Owen watched her work and realized she was always watching too, tracking movements, noting conversations, paying particular attention whenever the wagon master spoke with the handful of men traveling without families. "See those two?" she murmured to Owen on the second day, nodding toward a pair of men in dark coats standing apart from the main group. "The tall one calls himself Reverend Elias Crow. The silent one is Silas Pike. They're traveling as missionaries, bringing faith to the mining camps." "That seems admirable." "That seems suspicious. Missionaries usually travel with supplies, books, equipment. Those two have 4 heavy crates they won't let anyone touch, and a wagon that rides low like it's carrying weight." Owen glanced at the 2 men. Crow was handsome in a polished way with silver-shot hair and the kind of smile that made you want to trust him. Pike was his opposite, built like a bull, scarred face, never spoke. They stood beside their wagon like guards. "Maybe they're just careful with their belongings," Owen suggested. Delilah gave him a look that suggested he was being deliberately naive. "Out here, when something looks wrong, it usually is. Remember that." On the final night before departure, the wagon train gathered for a communal meal. Kane stood before the assembled families and delivered what was clearly a practice speech. "Tomorrow, we start the hard part. You've all paid your way, but money doesn't buy safety. That comes from following orders, watching out for each other, and keeping your heads down when trouble comes calling. We'll travel in formation, wagons in 2 columns, scouts ahead and behind. You see something suspicious, you report it. You don't play hero. We've got women and children on this train, and I'll shoot any man who puts them at risk through stupidity or pride. Questions? A hand went up. One of the younger men, barely 20, all swagger and new boots. What about raiders? I heard the Blackfoot are active in this territory. The Blackfoot are the least of our worries, Kane said flatly. We're taking a route that avoids their hunting grounds. What you need to worry about are the white raiders, deserters, outlaws, claim jumpers looking for easy targets. They hit wagon trains because we're slower than stagecoaches and richer than random travelers. You see strangers approaching, you let me know. You don't engage. Clear? The young man nodded, looking slightly less swagger-filled. One more thing, Kane continued. We've got a dentist on this train, Dr. Mercer. He'll handle medical emergencies since we don't have a proper doctor. You got a problem? You see him. Don't wait until it's a crisis. He fixed Owen with a stare. That means you're on call, dentist. Day or night. Someone needs help, you help them. Owen felt every eye turn toward him. His mouth went dry. I'll do my best. Best better be good enough. After the meal, Owen found himself sitting alone at the edge of the firelight, watching the families settle in for their last night before the journey. Children chased each other between wagons. Men checked equipment for the 100th time. Women spoke in low voices about the dangers ahead and the promises waiting at the end. Delilah appeared beside him with 2 tin cups of coffee. You look terrified. I am terrified. Good. Terrified keeps you careful. She handed him a cup. You did well today. Tom Henderson thinks you're teachable, which is high praise from him. I tied one knot correctly. That's hardly impressive. It's more than you could do 3 days ago. That's called progress. She sipped her coffee, staring into the flames. Tomorrow, when we start moving, stay close to the Henderson wagon. Watch how they handle problems. Learn from them. And if anything feels wrong, if someone approaches you, if you see something suspicious, you find me immediately. Understood? Why would someone approach me? Because you look like an easy mark. Because you're new and nervous and obviously out of your depth. There are people on this train who'll use that against you. She met his eyes. I need you to survive this journey, Owen. That means you need to start thinking like a survivor instead of a victim. I don't know how. Then learn fast. She walked away, leaving Owen alone with his coffee and his rising panic. Around him, the wagon train settled into sleep, 50 souls committed to a journey none of them could entirely predict. Families huddled together. Single men checked their weapons. And somewhere in the darkness, Delilah Voss moved with purpose, watching, waiting, searching for whoever she'd come to find. Owen lay in his bedroll that night, listening to the camp quiet down. Tom Henderson snored in the wagon above him. Delilah was somewhere out in the darkness. He'd learned she rarely slept in the wagon, preferring to keep watch in ways she never quite explained. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey that would either kill him or transform him. He'd signed on for this, married a stranger for this, committed his last resources to this. There was no going back to Philadelphia, no retreating to the safety of familiar failures. The frontier stretched ahead like a challenge he wasn't qualified to meet, and the only person who seemed to believe he could survive it was a woman with secrets behind every smile and a mission she refused to explain. Owen closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Out here, prayers felt like whispers into a void that didn't care about the hopes of frightened men from Philadelphia. So instead, he made himself a promise. He would survive, not through strength or courage. He had neither. But through stubborn refusal to be one more cautionary tale told around frontier campfires. He would learn. He would adapt. He would become whatever version of himself could endure this place. And maybe, just maybe, by the time they reached the mining camps, he'd discover that the man he'd been running away from back east was exactly the man he needed to be out here. But first, he had to live through tomorrow. The camp fell silent. Stars wheeled overhead in a sky so vast it made Owen feel like a speck of dust on an infinite plain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Closer by, horses shifted and nickered in their lines. And in the darkness beyond the firelight, Delilah Voss stood watch, her hand resting on something hidden beneath her coat, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats that Owen couldn't yet see but would soon learn to fear. Dawn came too fast. The camp exploded into motion before the sun cleared the horizon, families breaking down sleeping areas, men hitching teams, children being corralled and fed. Owen stumbled through preparations in a fog of inexperience, doing his best to help the Hendersons while staying out of their way. "You'll ride up front with me today," Tom said, gesturing to the wagon seat. "Might as well start learning the basics. Sarah'll keep the kids in back, and your wife said she'll scout ahead with the advance group." Owen blinked. "Delilah's scouting?" "Kane asked for volunteers who could ride and shoot. She volunteered. Surprised you didn't know that." "We haven't been married very long." Tom gave him a look that suggested he'd heard that excuse before and didn't buy it. "Uh-huh. Well, maybe use this journey to get to know her better. 6 weeks is plenty of time to figure out if you made a good choice." Owen wanted to explain that choice had very little to do with his current situation, but Kane was shouting for the train to form up. Wagons lurched into motion, wheels groaning against the packed earth. The Henderson wagon fell into line, and Owen found himself holding on to the seat as they rolled forward into a rising sun. The first day was endless. Every bump jarred his spine. Every hour brought new discomfort. Tom tried to teach him about reading the trail, judging distance, watching for obstacles, but Owen's mind kept drifting to Delilah somewhere ahead, riding with the scouts like she'd been doing this her whole life. Who was she really? What was she looking for, and why had she chosen him, useless, broke, terrified him, as her cover story? By the time they made camp that first night, Owen's body was one giant ache. He helped the Hendersons with practiced incompetence, then collapsed against a wagon wheel while they prepared dinner. "First day's always the worst," Sarah said kindly, handing him a plate of beans and salt pork. "Your body'll adjust. Give it a week." "I don't think I have a week in me." She laughed, not unkindly. "You'll surprise yourself. Everyone does." Delilah appeared after dark, her horse lathered and her expression grim. She dismounted smoothly, handed the reins to one of the other scouts, and made her way to where Owen sat nursing his bruises. "How was your first day?" she asked. "Excruciating. Yours?" "Productive." She sat beside him, close enough that he could smell trail dust and horse sweat. "Saw some interesting things." "Such as?" She glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. "Tracks. Multiple riders paralleling our route about 2 miles south. Could be nothing. Could be scouts checking our strength." Owen's stomach tightened. "Raiders? Maybe. Or just travelers going the same direction. Hard to say yet." She pulled a piece of jerky from her pocket and tore off a bite. "Kane's putting extra guards on watch tonight, which means you and I need to talk about what happens if we're attacked." "What happens?" "You stay down. You don't play hero. You let the men who know how to fight do the fighting." She fixed him with a serious look. "I mean it, Owen. The fastest way to die out here is trying to be brave when you don't know what you're doing." "I wasn't planning on being brave." "Good, because I need you alive, remember?" They sat in silence for a moment, watching the camp settle in. Families gathered around fires, men cleaned weapons and checked ammunition. Children were bundled into wagons for sleep. "Can I ask you something?" Owen said quietly. "You can ask." "I might not answer." "Who are you really looking for?" Delilah didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful. "Someone who stole something that doesn't belong to them. Someone who's been moving through wagon trains and mining camps, taking what they want and leaving bodies behind." "And you think they're on this train?" "I think they're somewhere along this route. Could be on the train. Could be waiting in the camps ahead. Could be I'm chasing shadows." She stood, brushing dust from her pants. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another long day." She walked away before Owen could ask more questions, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Owen sat there processing what little she'd revealed. She was hunting someone. A thief. Possibly a killer. And she'd married him to do it. He should have been terrified, should have demanded answers, insisted on the truth, maybe even considered abandoning this insane arrangement. But sitting there in the firelight, watching the wagon train bed down for the night, Owen realized something surprising. He didn't want to go back. Not to Philadelphia, not to safety, not to the life he'd been running from. Whatever this was, whatever danger Delilah was leading him into, it was better than the slow suffocation of his former existence. For the first time in his life, Owen Mercer was part of something bigger than himself. He might die doing it. He might be completely out of his depth, but at least he was moving forward instead of standing still. He finished his meal, checked on his dental equipment one more time, and made his bed beneath the Henderson wagon. Above him, stars wheeled through an endless sky. Around him, 50 souls slept uneasily, heading into country that promised opportunity and threatened death in equal measure. And somewhere in the darkness, Delilah Voss kept watch, hunting shadows and keeping secrets that Owen was only beginning to understand might get them both killed. Tomorrow, the real journey would continue. The frontier would test them, and Owen would discover whether the weakest man on the wagon train had any chance of becoming the kind of man who could survive in a land designed to break everyone who entered it. But tonight, exhausted and aching, he slept the deep sleep of someone who'd finally stopped running from one life and started stumbling toward another. Whatever came next, he'd face it, because turning back was no longer an option. The West had him now, and it wasn't letting go. The second week on the trail taught Owen that suffering came in layers. The first layer was physical, the constant ache in his back, the raw patches on his hands from gripping rope, the sunburn that turned his neck the color of boiled lobster. The second layer was mental, the gnawing awareness that he was always one mistake away from humiliation, always the slowest to understand what needed doing, always reaching for tools that real frontiersmen carried in their bones. The third layer was the growing certainty that something was very wrong with this wagon train. It started with small things. Delilah disappearing for hours during her scouting runs, returning with tension in her shoulders and questions in her eyes she wouldn't voice aloud. The way Reverend Crow always seemed to be watching when Owen stumbled through his daily incompetence, that polished smile never quite reaching his cold eyes. The heaviness of Pike's silence like violence held in check by the thinnest thread of restraint. And then there were the night sounds, hoofbeats in the distance, shadows moving beyond the firelight, the occasional gleam of metal where no metal should be. "You're learning to see," Delilah said one evening as they sat apart from the main camp. She'd started doing this, pulling Owen aside after dark, teaching him things Tom Henderson couldn't. Most people never do. They walk through the world blind to everything that doesn't slap them in the face. "I'm not sure I want to see," Owen admitted. Ignorance was more comfortable. Ignorance gets you killed. She was cleaning her rifle with practiced efficiency, the kind of familiarity that spoke of years, not months. "Tell me what you've noticed about Crow and Pike." Owen thought carefully before answering. He'd learned that Delilah's questions were never casual. They keep to themselves. They guard those crates like treasure. Pike never speaks, but he watches everything. And Crow? He paused, trying to articulate the wrongness he felt. "He's too smooth, too practiced, like he's playing a part." "Good. What else?" "They're popular. People trust Crow. He prays with the families, comforts the children, offers advice to the young men. Everyone thinks he's wonderful. Everyone except you and me." Delilah set down her rifle and pulled out a piece of paper covered in notes. "I've been tracking something. 4 wagon trains in the past 18 months, all following similar routes through mining country. Each one was hit by raiders, professional, organized attacks that targeted specific wagons and left others untouched. 23 people dead total. Hundreds of thousands in gold and goods stolen." Owen's throat went dry. "You think the attacks weren't random?" "I think someone's been helping the raiders, someone who knows which wagons carry wealth, which families won't fight back, exactly when and where the train is most vulnerable." She met his eyes. Each of those 4 trains had Crow and Pike aboard. They joined late, traveled to the mining camps, and left before anyone connected the pattern. "That's why you're here. You're not just looking for someone, you're hunting them." "I'm gathering proof. There's a difference." She folded the paper carefully. "But proof doesn't matter if we're all dead. So I need you to do something for me, and you're not going to like it." "What?" "Get close to Crow. He likes you, or at least he likes that you're weak and inexperienced. Men like him always gravitate toward people they can manipulate. Let him think he's winning you over. Learn what you can." Owen felt ice in his stomach. "You want me to spy on him?" "I want you to survive what's coming. If Crow trusts you, he might let something slip. If he sees you as harmless, he won't kill you when the shooting starts." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Make no mistake, Owen. There's going to be shooting. The only question is whether we see it coming in time to do something about it. Why me? Why not do this yourself? Because Crow's already suspicious of me. He knows I'm not what I pretend to be. But you? She almost smiled. You're exactly what you appear to be. A frightened dentist who has no business being here. That makes you perfect. Owen wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to explain that he wasn't brave enough, smart enough, capable enough for what she was asking. But he looked at Delilah's face in the firelight and saw something that stopped the words in his throat. She was scared too. She hid it better, wore it like a second skin instead of a burden, but the fear was there, sharp and immediate and absolutely certain of the danger ahead. All right, Owen heard himself say. I'll try. Don't try. Do. And Owen? She gripped his arm hard enough to hurt. If anything happens to me, you run. You take the fastest horse and you ride for the nearest settlement and you tell them about Crow and Pike and those crates. You don't play hero. You just run and tell. Understood? Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me anyway. Owen promised, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 days later, one of the Henderson children, the youngest boy, Michael, barely 6 years old, developed a raging fever that had Sarah Henderson near panic and Tom grim-faced with worry. They called for Owen late in the afternoon, their voices tight with fear that even frontier stoicism couldn't hide. Owen examined the boy with hands that tried not to shake. High fever, flushed skin, complaining of terrible pain in his jaw. When Owen gently pressed the swollen area, Michael screamed, tooth abscess. Badly infected, spreading into the surrounding tissue. In Philadelphia, this would mean extraction under controlled conditions, proper instruments, maybe ether if the family could afford it. Out here, it meant something far more brutal. I need to pull the tooth, Owen said quietly. Tonight. If the infection spreads further... He didn't finish the sentence. Sarah's face went white. Tom just nodded. What do you need? Light, lots of it, boiled water, clean cloth, and something for him to bite down on. Owen turned to his dental kit, hands moving through the instruments he'd practiced with in the safety of a Philadelphia surgery. I'll need help holding him still. Word spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire. By the time Owen had his instruments laid out, a crowd had gathered, families wanting to help, men offering advice, women bringing supplies. And threading through the chaos came Reverend Crow, his face arranged in an expression of pastoral concern. Dr. Mercer, Crow said smoothly, I heard about young Michael. How can I help? Owen was about to refuse, but he felt Delilah's eyes on him from somewhere in the crowd. This was his chance, the opening she'd asked him to take. Pray for him, Owen said, the words foreign in his mouth. And perhaps help keep him calm. Crow's smile widened. Of course, it would be my honor. The extraction was butchery dressed up as medicine. Michael screamed despite the leather strap between his teeth. Sarah wept. Tom held his son with the desperate strength of a man trying to physically fight death itself. And Owen pulled, twisted, and finally, mercifully, extracted the infected tooth along with a gush of pus that would have made his Philadelphia instructors proud and his mother faint. Through it all, Crow stood at the boy's head, one hand on Michael's burning forehead, murmuring words that might have been prayers or might have been theater. But his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging the crowd, noting who was distracted, measuring the camp's vulnerability in this moment of crisis. Owen saw it because Delilah had taught him to look, and what he saw chilled him more than the boy's screams. Crow was counting men, counting weapons, counting the distance between wagons. He was mapping the camp's defenses while everyone else watched a child suffer. When it was over and Michael lay pale but breathing in his mother's arms, the crowd dispersed with the kind of relief that comes from witnessing suffering that isn't yours. Sarah clutched Owen's hands with tears streaming down her face. You saved him. You saved my boy. The fever will break by morning, Owen said, though he wasn't entirely sure. Keep him cool. Give him water when he'll take it. If the swelling gets worse, it won't. I can feel it. You saved him. She hugged him fiercely, and Owen stood awkward in her embrace, aware of how desperately she needed to believe her son was safe. Crow appeared at his shoulder as the Hendersons returned to their wagon. "Impressive work, Dr. Mercer. You have a gift." "I have training. It's not the same thing." "Humility. How refreshing." Crow fell into step beside him as Owen cleaned his instruments with shaking hands. "Most men in your position would be crowing about their heroism, but not you. You deflect, you minimize, you act like what you just did wasn't extraordinary. It was basic dentistry. It was courage. That boy could have died from infection. You risked your reputation, your standing in this community, to help him. That takes a rare kind of bravery." Crow's voice was warm, friendly, completely sincere. "I've been watching you, Dr. Mercer. You're not like the other men here. You think before you act. You consider consequences. You don't mistake violence for strength." Owen felt the manipulation like oil on his skin. "I'm just trying to survive." "Survival is a noble goal, but perhaps you're capable of more." Crow glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Walk with me." They moved away from the main camp into the space between firelight and darkness, where conversations happened that couldn't survive scrutiny. Owen's heart hammered against his ribs. This was what Delilah wanted: access, information, the chance to learn what Crow was hiding, but it felt like walking into a trap with his eyes open. "Can I speak frankly?" Crow asked. "Please. This wagon train is going to be attacked, probably within the next 2 weeks." Crow said it like he was discussing the weather. "Raiders have been tracking us since Salvation Creek. They're waiting for the right moment, somewhere isolated, far from help, where they can hit us hard and fast." Owen stopped walking. "How do you know this?" "Because I've traveled this route before. I've seen the pattern, and I've learned to read the signs that everyone else misses." Crow's face was earnest in the moonlight. "Mr. Pike and I, we're not just missionaries, Dr. Mercer. We're also scouts, working with the territorial authorities to map raider activity. Those crates everyone's so curious about? Weapons, ammunition, supplies to help defend wagon trains when the inevitable attack comes." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly calibrated to Owen's fears and ignorance that for a moment he almost believed it. Almost. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because when the attack comes, people are going to die. Good people. Families like the Hendersons. And the men who survive, the men like Jacob Kane and Tom Henderson and the other frontiersmen, they'll fight back hard. But they'll need medical support. They'll need someone who can think clearly while everything falls apart." Crow placed a hand on Owen's shoulder. "I'm telling you because I think you're that man. And when the shooting starts, I want you on our side." "Our side?" "The side that wants these families to survive. The side that's willing to do what's necessary to protect innocent lives." Crow's grip tightened slightly. "I know you're afraid. I see it every time you look at this brutal country and wonder what possessed you to come here. But fear can be useful if you channel it correctly. Let it make you careful instead of cowardly. Let it help you prepare instead of paralyze you." Owen met Crow's eyes and saw something there that made his blood run cold. The man believed what he was saying, or rather, he believed his own performance so completely that truth and lies had merged into something indistinguishable. "I'll do whatever I can to help," Owen said carefully. "Good man." Crow released him, smiling like a teacher proud of a slow student. "Mr. Pike and I will be drilling some of the younger men in defensive tactics over the next few days. You're welcome to join us. Learn how to handle yourself when violence comes calling." "I don't know how to shoot." "Then it's time you learned. Out here, a man who can't defend himself is a liability. And I don't think you want to be a liability to that very interesting wife of yours." Owen's spine stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Only that Delilah is clearly a woman of considerable, competence. The kind of woman who needs a husband who can stand beside her, not hide behind her skirts." Crow's smile never wavered. "Think about my offer, Dr. Mercer. We'll be practicing at dawn, beyond the eastern perimeter. Join us if you're serious about surviving what's coming." He walked back toward the main camp, leaving Owen alone in the darkness with a head full of questions and a certainty that he'd just been tested in ways he didn't fully understand. Delilah found him 20 minutes later, materializing from the shadows like she'd been waiting for Crow to leave. "What did he say?" Owen repeated the conversation word for word, watching her face harden with each sentence. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. He's preparing you, she said finally, getting you comfortable with the idea of violence, making you feel like part of his team. When the attack comes, he wants you confused about whose side you're on. Why? I'm nobody. I can't help him. You can provide cover. Think about it. When the shooting starts and people are dying, who's going to suspect the frightened dentist who's trying to save lives? You're the perfect distraction. While everyone's watching you fumble with medical supplies, Crow and Pike can move the real cargo. What's in those crates? Rifles. Military-grade weapons stolen from an army shipment 6 months ago. They're worth a fortune to the right buyers. Renegade fighters, Mexican cartels, anyone willing to pay. Crow's been moving them through wagon trains because it's the perfect cover. Who searches missionaries? Her voice was tight with controlled fury. I've been trying to get proof for weeks, but Pike guards those crates like his life depends on it. Because it does. So what do? You go to that shooting practice tomorrow. You let Crow think he's winning you over. And you watch everything. Who's there, what they practice, how they talk. When they think no one important is listening. She gripped his arm. But Owen, listen to me carefully. When the attack comes, and it will come, you stay away from Crow and Pike. No matter what they tell you, no matter how much they need your help, you do not go near those crates. Understood? You think they'll try to kill me? I think they'll use you and discard you the moment you're no longer useful. Men like Crow don't leave witnesses. She released him, her face softening slightly. You did well tonight, with Michael, with Crow, with all of it. You're getting better at this. At what? Lying? Pretending I'm not terrified? At surviving. There's no shame in fear, Owen, only in letting it stop you from doing what needs to be done. She disappeared back into the darkness, leaving Owen alone with his thoughts and the distant sound of camp settling for another uneasy night. He returned to his bedroll beneath the Henderson wagon, where Michael's fever-broken breathing was the sweetest sound Owen had heard in days. Tomorrow, he would learn to shoot. Tomorrow, he would step further into Crow's trap while pretending to be the fool everyone believed him to be. Tomorrow, he would play a part that felt more dangerous than any he'd imagined when he left Philadelphia with dreams of frontier opportunity. But tonight, he'd saved a boy's life. Tonight, he'd done something that mattered, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The shooting practice started badly and got worse. Crow had assembled about a dozen men, mostly the younger ones, eager to prove themselves, plus a few older hands who wanted to refresh their skills. Pike stood silent and menacing, demonstrating technique with the cold efficiency of a professional killer. Owen held the rifle Crow handed him like it might explode. It probably would, given his complete lack of experience and the way his hands shook every time he tried to aim. Relax your shoulders, Crow instructed, moving behind Owen to adjust his stance. The rifle is a tool, not a curse. Treat it with respect, but don't fear it. I fear what it does, Owen said before he could stop himself. Then you're smarter than most of these boys. Crow's voice was low, meant only for Owen. Fear of weapons keeps you from using them carelessly, but fear of death should motivate you to master them quickly. Owen squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulder hard enough to spin him halfway around. His shot went wide, kicking up dirt 6 feet from the target. The other men laughed. Not cruelly, but with the camaraderie of people who'd all started somewhere. Again, Pike said. It was the first word Owen had ever heard from the man, and his voice was like gravel scraping against stone. They practiced for 2 hours. By the end, Owen could hit the target maybe 1 time in 5, which Crow declared adequate for a beginner, with the kind of faint praise that felt like failure. The other men were better, much better, and Owen noticed that several of them handled their weapons with the smooth confidence of people who'd been shooting much longer than they admitted. You're recruiting, Owen said quietly to Crow as they cleaned rifles afterward. These aren't just defensive drills. Crow glanced at him with something like approval. You're more observant than you pretend. Yes, I'm recruiting. When the attack comes, we'll need men who can fight back effectively. Mr. Kane has his people, but they're spread thin protecting the entire train. A secondary force, properly armed and trained, could make the difference between survival and slaughter. And after the attack, what happens to this secondary force? They go back to their lives as farmers and miners and whatever else they came west to be. Crow's smile was warm and utterly false. Unless, of course, they want to continue. There's always need for capable men in this territory, men who can be relied upon for difficult work. Owen understood then. Crow wasn't just moving weapons, he was building a network, recruiting people who could be used for future operations, creating a web of dependence and obligation that would outlast any single wagon train. "I'm not a fighter," Owen said. "No, but you're a man people trust. That's worth more than marksmanship." Crow handed him the cleaned rifle. "Keep this. Practice when you can. And remember what I said about choosing sides. The attack is coming, Dr. Mercer. Make sure you're standing with the people who will remember you helped them." Owen took the rifle back to camp, feeling its weight like a chain. Delilah intercepted him before he reached the Henderson wagon. "You look like hell," she observed. "I feel worse." Owen set down the rifle carefully. Crow's not just a smuggler. He's building something bigger, using the wagon trains as recruiting grounds. "I know, I've been tracking similar patterns in other territories." She studied the rifle with a professional eye. "He gave you this?" "Told me to practice." "He's marking you, making sure everyone sees you as part of his group." She picked up the weapon, checked the load, set it down. "This is good quality, military issue, probably from the same shipment as the crates." "Delilah, how do you know all this? Who are you really?" She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. Finally, she sighed. "You deserve to know, but not here. Tonight, after everyone's asleep, meet me at the eastern edge of camp. And Owen, bring that rifle. We need to talk about what happens when everything goes wrong." The rest of the day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Owen checked on Michael Henderson, who was recovering beautifully. The resilience of children never stopped amazing him. He helped Tom with wagon repairs, learning the basics of woodwork and leather mending. He ate dinner with the families, listening to their hopes and fears about the mining camps ahead. And all the while, he watched Crow and Pike moving through the camp like wolves among sheep, always friendly, always helpful, always calculating. When full dark came and the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Owen took the rifle and slipped away from the Henderson wagon. He found Delilah waiting in the shadows beyond the perimeter, sitting on a rock with her own rifle across her knees. "Sit," she said. Owen sat. 3 years ago," Delilah began without preamble, "my brother was killed in a wagon train attack outside Fort Collins. He was 17, traveling with his new wife to start a mining claim. The raiders took everything, money, goods, lives. 23 people died. The territorial marshal called it random violence. Bad luck. One of those tragedies that happens in lawless country." She paused, staring into the darkness. "I didn't believe it. My brother was careful, smart, not the kind to take stupid risks. So I started asking questions. Found out the attack wasn't random at all. It was targeted, professional, organized by someone who knew exactly which wagon carried the payroll for a mining operation. Someone who had detailed information about the train's route and defenses." "Crow," Owen said. "Crow. I couldn't prove it then. He was long gone by the time I started investigating. But I followed the pattern. 4 more attacks over 18 months, all following the same profile. Each time, Crow and Pike were there beforehand, traveling as missionaries, earning trust, mapping vulnerabilities. And each time, they disappeared just before the raiders struck. Why hasn't anyone stopped them? Because they're careful. They never participate directly in the attacks. They just provide information to the raiders, for a cut of the profits. And they move the stolen weapons afterward, making themselves doubly valuable to the criminal networks operating in this territory." She met his eyes. "I've been working with federal marshals for the past year, trying to build a case. But we need proof. Solid, undeniable evidence that connects them to the attacks." "The crates. The crates. If I can prove they're carrying stolen military weapons, we can arrest them before the attack happens. Save these families. Break the network." Her voice hardened. "But I need to get inside those crates, and Pike never leaves them unguarded. So what's the plan? The attack will come in the next few days. Crow's getting nervous. I can see it in how he's rushing the recruitment, how Pike's watching the perimeter more carefully. They're waiting for the right moment, the perfect ambush point." She stood, pacing. "When it happens, there'll be chaos. That's when I'll make my move. Get to the crates, document what's inside, and signal the marshals who've been tracking us from a distance. Owen felt ice in his stomach. Marshals? You have backup? 2 men staying far enough back that Crow won't spot them. They'll move in when I give the signal. But Owen, she gripped his shoulders. If something happens to me, if Crow or Pike figure out who I really am before I can get that proof, you need to finish this. You need to get one of those crates open and get evidence to the marshals. Can you do that? I'm not. Can you do it? Her voice was steel. Owen thought about Michael Henderson, recovering from an infection that could have killed him. He thought about Sarah's tears of gratitude and Tom's quiet respect. He thought about all the families on this train who had no idea that men like Crow were selling their safety for profit. Yes, he said, I can do it. Good. She released him, but her expression remained grave. There's something else you need to know. When the attack comes, people are going to look to you for help. You're the closest thing to a doctor we have, which means you'll be moving through the chaos, treating wounds, trying to save lives. That makes you valuable and vulnerable. Stay low, don't take risks, and if someone tells you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. Now let's talk about this rifle. She picked up the weapon Crow had given him. You shoot like a man who's afraid of what he's holding. That needs to change. You don't need to be a marksman, but you need to be competent enough to protect yourself when everything falls apart. She spent the next hour teaching him things no Philadelphia dental school had covered. How to load quickly under stress, how to aim when your hands were shaking, how to shoot and move instead of becoming a stationary target. Owen was terrible at all of it, but he got marginally less terrible with practice. You'll never be a gunfighter, Delilah said finally, but you might survive long enough to matter. That's the goal. They returned to camp separately, Owen slipping back beneath the Henderson wagon with his rifle and a head full of knowledge he'd never wanted. He lay awake, listening to the night sounds, horses shifting, guards walking their rounds, the distant cry of some predator celebrating a kill. Somewhere out in the darkness, raiders were watching. Somewhere closer, Crow and Pike were planning. And somewhere between those two threats, federal marshals were waiting for a signal that might never come. Owen closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but every sound made him flinch. Every shadow became a threat. The frontier had finally broken through his last defenses, replacing comfortable ignorance with the terrible awareness of exactly how fragile his life had become. The attack came 4 days later, in the worst possible place. They'd entered a canyon, narrow, with high walls on both sides and only one way forward. Kane had wanted to avoid it, but the alternate route would have added a week to their journey and supplies were running low. So they'd gambled, moving into the choke point with extra guards posted and everyone on edge. It was mid-afternoon when the first shot rang out. Owen was walking alongside the Henderson wagon, discussing Michael's continued recovery with Sarah, when the bullet struck the wagon behind them. Wood exploded into splinters. Sarah screamed. And suddenly the world became chaos. Riders appeared on both ridges, maybe 20 of them, firing down into the wagon train with terrifying efficiency. Kane bellowed orders, men scrambled for weapons, women dragged children beneath wagons. The air filled with gun smoke and screaming and the thunder of hooves. Owen dropped flat, his rifle forgotten, every instinct screaming at him to run. But Sarah Henderson was frozen in panic, standing exposed in the middle of the trail. Without thinking, Owen lunged forward and dragged her down behind a water barrel. "Stay here," he gasped. "Don't move." He crawled toward the Henderson wagon, where Tom was returning fire with grim determination. Michael and the other kids? Under the wagon. Sarah? Behind the barrel. What do you need? Medical supplies. We've got wounded. Tom's words were cut off by another volley of gunfire. Owen scrambled to his feet and ran, through the chaos toward the wagon where he'd stored his dental kit and the basic medical supplies he'd brought from Philadelphia. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. Someone screamed his name, maybe Delilah, maybe Tom. He couldn't tell through the ringing in his ears. He reached the supplies, grabbed everything he could carry, and turned to run back. That's when he saw Crow and Pike moving not toward the fight, but away from it, heading for their wagon with its precious crates. Delilah had been right. This wasn't just an attack. It was a coordinated operation, and Crow was using the chaos to move his merchandise. Owen should have turned away, should have focused on helping the wounded, Should have done exactly what Delilah had told him and stayed out of Crow's business. Instead, he dropped his supplies and followed them. The crates were already being loaded onto a separate wagon, smaller, faster, ready to break away from the main train. Pike was handling them with practiced efficiency while Crow watched the battle, timing something in his head. "Dr. Mercer!" Crow's voice was sharp with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Owen's mind raced. "Looking for you. We need your help. The wounded." "Mr. Pike and I have other priorities right now." Crow's friendly mask had slipped, revealing something colder underneath. "Go back to the families. Do what you do best." "Those crates," Owen said, the words spilling out before his brain could stop them. "What's really in them?" Crow's expression went flat. "That's not your concern." "It is if you're the reason we're being attacked." The words hung in the air between them. Pike stopped loading crates, his massive frame turning toward Owen with the slow inevitability of a rock slide. Crow's hand moved toward his hip, where a pistol rested in a well-worn holster. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," Crow said softly. "Or stupider. I haven't decided which. I just want to help these people." "Then help them by forgetting what you've seen here." Crow's voice was reasonable, almost kind. "Go back to playing dentist. Let men like Mr. Pike and I handle the complicated work. Everyone lives, everyone profits, and you get to keep your illusions about frontier justice." Owen should have agreed, should have backed away, returned to the wounded, forgotten this confrontation entirely. But he thought about Delilah's brother, 17 and dead in a ditch. He thought about the Henderson family and all the others who'd trusted men like Crow with their lives. "No," Owen said. Pike drew his gun so fast Owen barely saw the movement. The barrel pointed directly at Owen's chest, unwavering and absolutely lethal. "Poor choice," Crow said. "Mister." "Pike, why don't you—" The shot came from the ridge above them, a single precise crack of a rifle. Pike jerked, the gun falling from his hand as blood bloomed across his shoulder. He roared with pain and fury, spinning toward the source. Delilah stood on the ridge, her rifle smoking, her face a mask of cold purpose. "Run, Owen!" she screamed. "Run now!" Owen ran. He crashed through the chaos of the battle, dodging horses and bullets and his own panic. Behind him, he could hear Crow shouting orders, Pike's roar of rage, Delilah's rifle firing again and again to cover his escape. He reached the Henderson wagon and threw himself beneath it, where Tom grabbed him with hands like iron. "What in hell were you thinking?" "I wasn't," Owen gasped. "I just—" "Crow. The crates?" Another volley of gunfire cut off his explanation. But something had changed. The attackers were breaking off, their leader, a scarred man on a black horse, shouting orders to retreat. The wagon train defenders cheered, thinking they'd won. Owen knew better. The raiders weren't retreating. They were regrouping, waiting for Crow's signal to finish what they'd started. He found Delilah 20 minutes later, pressed against a boulder with blood staining her sleeve and her rifle out of ammunition. "You're an idiot," she said when she saw him. "I know. You almost got yourself killed." "I know that too." He knelt beside her, examining the wound, a graze across her upper arm, painful but not serious. "Why did you save me?" "Because you're my husband, remember? Even fake marriages come with obligations." She winced as he wrapped the wound with cloth torn from his shirt. "Did you see what's in the crates?" "No, but Crow knows I'm onto him. Pike too." "Then we've got a problem. Crow won't let you live now that you know too much." She checked her empty rifle with a frustrated curse. "The marshals should have moved in by now. Something's wrong." The answer came with the sunset. 2 bodies were discovered on the ridge where Delilah's backup should have been waiting. Federal marshals, throats cut, stripped of their weapons and identification. They'd been dead for at least a day, killed before they could intervene. "Crow knew," Delilah said, her voice hollow. "He knew about the marshals. Knew about me. This whole thing was a trap." Owen's blood went cold. "Then why keep you alive?" "Because he needs me to make his move. I'm the bait that keeps his story believable." She met Owen's eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. "Owen, we need to assume everyone on this train is in danger. Crow's not just moving weapons anymore. He's eliminating witnesses, and we're at the top of his list." That night, the camp gathered to tend the wounded and count the dead. 3 families had lost members. 7 more were injured seriously enough to need Owen's shaking hands and inadequate supplies. He worked through the night, pulling bullets, stitching wounds, trying desperately to save lives with skills meant for pulling teeth. Crow appeared in the firelight, his face a mask of concern. "Dr. Mercer, you're doing heroic work." Owen didn't look up from the wound he was treating. "Just doing my job." "More than your job. You're saving lives." Crow moved closer, his voice dropping. "I think we should talk, privately, about what you saw today." "Nothing to talk about." "I disagree, but we can discuss it later after you've finished here." Crow's hand rested briefly on Owen's shoulder, a gesture that could have been friendly or threatening. "Don't do anything foolish, Dr. Mercer. Not when you've finally found your purpose." He walked away, leaving Owen with the terrible certainty that tomorrow would bring either proof or death. Probably both. Delilah found him near midnight, after the last wound was bandaged and the camp had settled into exhausted sleep. "We can't wait for more marshals. We need to act now." "How? Pike's guarding those crates with a bullet wound and pure hatred. Crow's watching us both. And we have no backup. We have you." She gripped his hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're the one person Crow still underestimates. He thinks you're weak, harmless, too scared to be a threat. That's our advantage." "I am weak and harmless and scared." "No, you pulled a tooth from a screaming child. You ran through gunfire to get medical supplies. You confronted Crow even though you knew it might get you killed." Her voice was fierce. "You're not the man who got off the stage in Salvation Creek. You've changed. You just haven't realized it yet." Owen wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the courage she saw in him, but all he felt was the weight of everything he didn't know and couldn't do. "What's your plan?" he asked. "Tomorrow, those crates move. Crow can't risk staying with the wagon train now that people are asking questions. He'll break away, claim he's going for help or supplies or whatever lie works. When he does, we follow. We get proof of what's in those crates, and we make sure the truth gets out, even if we don't survive to tell it." "That's not much of a plan." "It's the only one we've got." She stood, checking her weapons with practiced efficiency. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we finish this." But Owen didn't sleep. He lay beneath the Henderson wagon, listening to the camp breathe around him, and thought about the impossible distance between who he'd been and who he was becoming. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a dentist with soft hands and softer dreams. Now he was a man who'd been shot at, lied to, married under false pretenses, and was planning to confront armed criminals with nothing but stubborn refusal to stay down. The frontier had broken him, but maybe, just maybe, it was remaking him into something that could survive. Somewhere in the darkness, Crow and Pike were planning. Somewhere closer, Delilah was preparing for a fight she might not win. And caught between them, Owen Mercer finally understood what his former fiancée had meant about being too scared to be ordinary. He wasn't running from responsibility anymore. He was running towards something much more dangerous. The chance to matter, to help, to stand up when everything in him screamed to run away. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would bring violence. Tomorrow would test whether the weakest man on the wagon train had found strength or just new and creative ways to fail. But tonight, in the darkness before dawn, Owen made himself a promise. Whatever came, he wouldn't hide, wouldn't retreat into comfort or safety, wouldn't let fear make his choices anymore. The West had him now, and he was done pretending he wanted to leave. Dawn brought no comfort, only the certainty that everything was about to break wide open. Owen woke to find the camp already stirring with an energy that felt wrong, too purposeful, too organized for a group that should have been recovering from yesterday's attack. He crawled out from beneath the Henderson wagon to find men gathering near Crow's position, their faces hard with determination that looked rehearsed rather than natural. Tom Henderson was checking his rifle with grim efficiency. "Meeting in 5 minutes. Kane wants everyone armed and ready." "Ready for what?" "Crow says the Raiders will hit us again today. Says we need to be prepared to fight or run." Tom's jaw tightened. "I don't trust that smooth-talking bastard, but Pike took a bullet protecting those supply crates yesterday. Maybe they're what Crow claims after all." Owen felt his stomach drop. The lie was spreading, taking root in soil fertilized by fear and desperation. Crow wasn't just manipulating individuals anymore. He was controlling the entire narrative. Where's Delilah? Scouting the rear perimeter. She left before sunrise. Tom gave Owen a measuring look. Your wife's got more sand than most men I know. You're lucky to have her. I know, Owen said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. He found her 20 minutes later, crouched behind a rock formation overlooking the trail they'd traveled yesterday. Her eyes were hard as she tracked movement in the distance. 4 riders, she said without turning, staying just out of rifle range, watching us. They've been there since first light. More raiders? Scouts, making sure we follow the route Crow wants us to take. She lowered her spyglass and met Owen's eyes. It's happening today. Crow's going to make his move, probably within the next few hours. We need to be ready. Kane's calling a meeting. Everyone's gathering to hear Crow's plan for defending against another attack. Of course he is. He'll use the meeting to solidify his control, make himself indispensable. Delilah stood, dusting off her pants. Listen carefully, Owen. When Crow makes his move, there's going to be confusion. People will be scared, looking for someone to follow. That's when he'll separate his recruited men from the main group, claim he's taking them to a defensive position or to flank the raiders or some other tactical-sounding nonsense. And you think that's when he'll move the crates. I know it is. He can't afford to stay with the wagon train anymore. Too many questions, too much scrutiny. He'll break away with Pike and his recruits, take the weapons, and leave the rest of us to deal with whatever attack he's arranged. Her voice was cold with certainty. We need to be on that breakaway wagon. It's the only way to get proof. They'll never let us come. They won't let me come. But you? She gripped at his shoulders. Crow still thinks you're useful. He'll want you there to treat Pike's wound, to provide medical support for his men. You need to volunteer before he can exclude you. Owen's mouth went dry. And then what? Then you stay alive long enough for me to catch up. I'll follow at a distance, wait for the right moment to make my move. She pulled something from her pocket, a small leather-bound journal filled with notes and sketches. If something happens to me, this contains everything I know about Crow's operation. Names, dates, routes, the whole network. You get this to the nearest territorial marshal's office, no matter what it costs. Delilah, promise me. Her eyes were fierce. Promise me you'll finish this if I can't. Owen took the journal, feeling its weight like an accusation. I promise. Good. She checked her weapons one final time. Now get to that meeting. Play your part. And Owen? She almost smiled. Try not to get yourself killed in the next few hours. I've gotten used to having you around. The meeting was theater, and Crow was the lead performer. He stood before the assembled wagon train with blood staining his sleeve from yesterday's fighting and his face arranged in an expression of noble concern. Friends, he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Yesterday we faced evil and survived, but I won't lie to you. The threat isn't over. Those raiders will return, probably today, and when they do, we need to be ready. Kane stood nearby, his expression unreadable. Owen noticed the wagon master's hand never strayed far from his pistol, and his eyes kept tracking Crow with the wariness of a man who'd finally started asking the right questions. Mr. Pike and I have been discussing strategy, Crow continued. The canyon ahead narrows even further before it opens into the valley. If the raiders hit us there, we'll be trapped. But if we can position a defensive force on the high ground before they attack, we can turn their ambush into our advantage. One of the younger recruits, a farm boy named Danny, who'd been practicing shooting with Pike, raised his hand. How many men would you need? 8, maybe 10, enough to hold a position and lay down covering fire while the main wagon train pushes through to safety. Crow's gaze swept across the crowd, landing briefly on each of his carefully cultivated recruits. I won't sugarcoat this. It's dangerous work. Some of you might not make it back. But you'll save lives. Families. Children. The recruits were already stepping forward, exactly as Crow had planned. Danny, along with 3 others Owen recognized from the shooting practices. 2 older men who'd lost family in yesterday's attack and wanted revenge. A drifter named Cole, who'd joined the train in Salvation Creek and had always felt slightly wrong to Owen, though he couldn't articulate why. I'll go, Tom Henderson said. and Owen's heart sank. Sarah grabbed her husband's arm. Tom, no, the children need you. The children need me to make sure they live through this. Tom's voice was gentle but immovable. I'm going. Owen saw his chance and took it before courage could abandon him. I'll come too. Every head turned toward him. Crow's eyebrows rose in what looked like genuine surprise. Dr. Mercer, Crow said slowly, your bravery is commendable, but Mr. Pike's wounded. You'll need someone who can treat injuries if your men get hit. Owen forced steadiness into his voice. I'm not much of a fighter, but I can keep people alive. That's worth something. The silence stretched out. Owen could feel Delilah's eyes on him from somewhere in the crowd, willing him to sell the performance. Could feel Crow calculating, weighing the advantages of having a medical man against the risk of bringing someone who'd seen too much. Finally, Crow smiled. You're absolutely right. We'd be honored to have you, Doctor. Your skills could make the difference between life and death out there. Kane stepped forward. Hold on. Mercer's not a soldier. He'll slow you down. He'll save lives, Crow countered smoothly. And if we're asking men to risk themselves for this community, the least we can do is give them proper medical support. He extended his hand to Owen. What do you say, Dr. Mercer? Ready to be a hero? Owen shook the offered hand, feeling the trap close around him. Ready as I'll ever be. The plan was set in motion with terrifying efficiency. Crow's group would leave immediately, taking the smaller supply wagon, the one Owen now knew contained the weapons crates, to their defensive position on the ridge. The main wagon train would follow an hour later, giving the defenders time to set up before the raiders attacked. Sarah Henderson clutched Owen's hands, tears streaming down her face. You bring my Tom back. You hear me? You bring him home. I will, Owen promised, though he had no idea if he could keep that promise. Delilah found him as he loaded his medical supplies onto Crow's wagon. She moved close, speaking so quietly only he could hear. The ridge position is a lie. There is no defensive position, just rough country where Crow can disappear with the weapons. Once you're far enough from the main train, he'll make his real move. She pressed something into his hand, a small signal mirror. When you see the crates being opened, use this. 3 flashes. I'll be watching. And if you can't get there in time, then you run. You take the journal and you run, and you don't look back. Her jaw tightened. But I will get there, Owen. I've been chasing these bastards for 3 years. I'm not stopping now. Pike appeared around the wagon, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his eyes sharp and suspicious. Time to go, dentist. Delilah stepped back, her face becoming that of a worried wife watching her husband ride into danger. Be careful. I will. And Owen? Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. If it comes down to saving yourself or keeping that promise to Sarah Henderson, you save yourself. Tom knew the risks. You don't have to die proving you're brave enough. But Owen wasn't sure that was true anymore. Somewhere in the past weeks, between being swindled and married and shot at and forced to pull teeth in the middle of hostile territory, he'd stopped being the man who measured worth in safety. He'd become someone who understood that some promises mattered more than survival. The ride into the hills was tense and silent. Crow led the way with practiced confidence, following paths that suggested he'd scouted this route before. Pike drove the supply wagon with the crates, his massive frame tense with pain and anger. The recruits followed in a loose formation, weapons ready, scanning for threats. Owen rode beside Tom Henderson, whose face had gone grim and closed since leaving his family. You ever kill a man? Tom asked quietly. No. Me neither. Shot plenty of animals. Never pointed a gun at another human being. He checked his rifle for the 100th time. Guess today might change that. Tom, about Crow, I know. Tom's voice was flat. I know he's not what he pretends. Been watching him, same as you and your wife. But those are my kids back there, Owen. My Sarah. If there's even a chance Crow's plan keeps them safe, I've got to take it. And if it doesn't, if he's leading us into something worse, then I guess we find out what kind of men we really are. Tom met Owen's eyes. You're scared. I can see it. Hell, I'm scared too. But fear's just another thing trying to kill you out here. You can't let it. They rode for another hour, climbing into rougher terrain where the wagon wheels groaned against loose rock, and the horses picked their way carefully through scrub brush. Owen kept watching for Delilah, hoping to catch some sign she was following, but the landscape behind them remained empty. Finally, Crow called a halt in a narrow defile between two rock walls. "This is it. We set up here." Danny, the farm boy, looked around with obvious confusion. "Sir, this doesn't seem like much of a defensive position. We can't see the trail from here." "That's because this isn't our defensive position, son." Crow's voice had changed, the warm pastoral tone replaced by something colder and more businesslike. "This is where we part ways with the wagon train." The recruits exchanged uncertain glances. Tom's hand moved toward his rifle. Owen felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "I don't understand," Tom said carefully. "I think you do." Crow dismounted smoothly, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "You're all smart men. You've seen what's in those crates. You know this was never about defending the wagon train." Pike had stopped the supply wagon and was now standing with his rifle pointed casually but unmistakably at the group. The drifter Cole moved to flank them from the other side, his weapon also drawn. Two of the other recruits, men Owen had thought were just frightened farmers, revealed themselves as part of Crow's crew with practiced efficiency. They were surrounded, outgunned, and miles from help. "Here's how this works," Crow continued, his voice reasonable and utterly merciless. "Those crates contain property that belongs to certain business associates of mine, valuable property that needs to reach its destination. You gentlemen are going to help ensure that happens. And if we refuse," Tom's voice was steady despite the rifles pointed at him, "then Mr. Pike will demonstrate what happens to people who make poor choices." Crow's smile never wavered. "But I don't think you'll refuse, because your families are still with that wagon train, unprotected, vulnerable. And if anything unfortunate were to happen to us out here, well, accidents happen on the frontier all the time." Owen felt rage cutting through his fear. "You're threatening children. I'm explaining consequences. There's a difference." Crow turned his attention to Owen with the focus of a predator selecting prey. "And you, Dr. Mercer, I'm disappointed. I really thought you understood how things work out here, but you had to go snooping, had to play detective with that very interesting wife of yours." "You knew?" "Of course I knew. Delilah Voss isn't nearly as clever as she thinks. Federal informant hunting for proof of my involvement in the wagon train attacks. Really quite tedious." Crow sighed theatrically. "She should be arriving soon, actually. She's been following us for the past 20 minutes. Mr. Pike, would you like to greet our guest?" Pike's rifle swung toward the rocks above them. A shot rang out, and Delilah's voice shouted in pain or anger. Owen couldn't tell which. His stomach lurched. "Don't kill her yet," Crow called up. "Bring her down. I want her to see how this ends." Two more of Crow's hidden men appeared on the ridge, dragging Delilah between them. She was fighting, cursing, bleeding from a gash on her temple, but they had her arms pinned and her weapons stripped away. They threw her down into the dirt at Crow's feet. "There we are," Crow said pleasantly. "All the players assembled. Now we can discuss terms." Delilah spat blood and glared up at him. "There are no terms. You're done, Crow. Every marshal in the territory knows about your operation." "The marshals who are conveniently dead?" "Yes, I heard about that. Tragic accident." Crow crouched beside her. "Face it, Miss Voss, you lost. You've been losing since the moment you thought you could outplay me. And now you're going to watch as I turn your failure into profit." He stood, addressing the captured group with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. "Here's the new arrangement. You're all going to help transport these weapons to my buyers. In exchange, your families continue breathing. Refuse and I send word to my associates watching the wagon train. They'll make it look like another raider attack. Quick, bloody, conclusive." "You're insane," Tom said. "I'm practical. There's a fortune in those crates. Military rifles stolen from an army shipment, worth more than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. My buyers will pay handsomely, and everyone who helps will get a cut. Enough money to set up your mining claims without breaking your backs. Enough to buy your family's real futures instead of the gambling subsistence you're chasing." Crow's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality. "Think about it. One job, one transport, and you're set for life." Danny, the farm boy, actually looked tempted. "How much money?" "Don't listen to him," Delilah snarled. "He's lying. The moment you're no longer useful, he'll kill you all. That's his pattern. Use people, then eliminate the witnesses. Crow backhanded her casually, the crack of flesh on flesh making Owen flinch. I'm offering you gentlemen a choice. Take it or leave it, but decide fast. We need to be moving within the hour. Owen looked at the men around him. Tom Henderson, jaw clenched with fury and fear for his family. Danny and the other recruits, young and out of their depth, calculating whether Crow's offer might be their best chance. The drifter Cole and Crow's other plants, waiting to see who'd need killing. And Delilah, bleeding in the dirt, but her eyes still fierce, still calculating, still fighting even when the fight looked lost. This was the moment, the fulcrum point where everything balanced between survival and principle, between pragmatism and the kind of stubborn refusal to bend that got people killed on the frontier. Owen thought about Philadelphia, about the safe life he'd abandoned, about his mother's tears and his father's disappointment and his former fiancé's prediction that he'd run from responsibility forever. Then he thought about Michael Henderson's fever breaking, about Sarah's gratitude and Tom's quiet respect, about Delilah's fierce determination to stop men like Crow from destroying families like the one who'd taken her brother. He stepped forward. No. The word came out smaller than he'd intended, barely audible over the wind, but it was enough. Crow turned toward him with raised eyebrows. I'm sorry, Dr. Mercer. Did you say something? Owen's hands were shaking, but he forced himself to meet Crow's eyes. I said no, we're not helping you. You're going to let us go. You're going to turn yourself in, and you're going to face justice for what you've done. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then Crow started laughing, genuine, delighted laughter that echoed off the rock walls. Oh, that's precious. The scared little dentist finding his courage at exactly the wrong moment. Crow wiped tears from his eyes. Mr. Pike, I think Dr. Mercer needs a demonstration of how seriously we should take his ultimatum. Pike raised his rifle, aiming directly at Owen's chest. Owen stared at the barrel and felt time slow down. This was it. This was how he died. Not from disease or accident or old age, but from choosing to stand when every survival instinct screamed at him to kneel. Wait! Tom Henderson stepped in front of Owen, his own rifle coming up. You want to shoot him? You go through me first. Danny moved next, his young face pale but determined. And me. One by one, the other recruits shifted their positions, forming a rough line between Owen and Pike's gun. They were terrified. Owen could see it in their faces, but they stood anyway, because sometimes on the frontier you had to choose what kind of man you were going to be, and these men had chosen. Crow's smile faded. You're all making a terrible mistake. Probably, Tom agreed, but we'll make it standing up. Then you'll die standing up. Crow nodded to Pike. Kill them. All of them. We'll make it look like the Raiders did it. Pike's finger tightened on the trigger. Owen closed his eyes, waiting for the impact he'd never feel, the bullet that would end his brief and chaotic frontier adventure before he'd figured out what any of it meant. The shot never came. Instead, there was a sharp crack from the ridge above, and one of Crow's men dropped with a scream. Another shot followed, then another, precise and deadly. The hidden gunmen on the ridge were falling, picked off by someone shooting with terrifying accuracy. Delilah rolled sideways, sweeping the legs out from under the man guarding her. She came up with his pistol in her hand and put a bullet through Cole's shoulder before anyone could react. The defile exploded into chaos, shots echoing off rock walls, men diving for cover, horses screaming and bolting. Owen hit the ground, covering his head, completely useless in the sudden firefight. Above him, Tom Henderson was firing methodically, using the wagon for cover. Danny had grabbed a rifle from one of the fallen men and was shooting with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Delilah was moving like a ghost through the chaos, appearing just long enough to take down another of Crow's crew before vanishing into shadow. And on the ridge above, Owen caught a glimpse of something impossible. A lone figure in cavalry blue, firing a repeating rifle with the precision of a professional soldier. The marshal. Another marshal. Backup Delilah hadn't known she had. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes. Crow's carefully constructed plan unraveled as his men fell or fled, leaving him standing alone with Pike, who was bleeding from a fresh wound and looking murderous. Give it up, Crow, Delilah shouted from behind a boulder. It's over. The marshal's here. Your operation's finished. Nothing's finished, Crow snarled, his polished veneer finally cracking. Pike, get those crates loaded. We're leaving. But Pike was staring at the ridge where the marshal stood, at the bodies of his crew scattered across the defile, at the recruits who'd chosen death over cooperation. For the first time since Owen had met him, the silent enforcer looked uncertain. Pike, Crow snapped. I gave you an order. Pike's gaze shifted to Crow, then to the wagon, then back to the growing disaster. Finally, without a word, he lowered his rifle. Not in surrender, just in the recognition that some fights weren't worth continuing. Crow's face twisted with fury and disbelief. You're abandoning me? After everything? After everything, you're on your own. Pike's voice was rough from disuse. I signed up to move guns, not massacre families. This ain't what we agreed to. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the rocks with the casual confidence of a man who knew this country well enough to vanish. Crow watched him go, his expression cycling through rage and panic before settling into something colder. Well then, he said, pulling his pistol. I suppose if I'm going down, I might as well take some of you with me. He fired twice, wild, desperate shots that ricocheted off stone. Tom Henderson returned fire, catching Crow in the leg and dropping him to his knees. The pistol fell from his hand, clattering across the rocks. Delilah was there in an instant, her gun pressed to the back of Crow's head. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't give me a reason. The marshal descended from the ridge, a weathered cavalry officer with lieutenant's bars and the hardened look of someone who'd seen too much frontier justice to have illusions about it. He surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction. Miss Voss, looks like you finally got your proof. More than proof, Lieutenant Barnes. We've got Crow, we've got the weapons, and we've got witnesses. Delilah's voice was tight with controlled emotion. It's over. Barnes moved to the supply wagon and pried open one of the crates. Military rifles, exactly as Delilah had claimed, packed in straw and ready for transport. He pulled out an evidence journal and began documenting, his movements methodical and practiced. Owen stood on shaking legs, trying to process what had just happened. They'd survived. Against every odd, every advantage Crow had possessed, they'd somehow survived. Tom Henderson appeared beside him, gripping his shoulder. You all right, son? I don't know, am I? You stood up when it mattered. That's about as all right as any man can be. Tom's voice was rough with emotion. Thank you, for whatever crazy thing you and your wife were trying to do, for not letting that bastard win. Danny and the other recruits were gathered in a tight group, looking shell-shocked and considerably older than they had that morning. One of them was crying silently, the adrenaline crash hitting hard. Another was praying, though Owen suspected the prayers were as much for what they'd nearly done as for what they'd survived. Lieutenant Barnes finished his documentation and turned to Delilah. We'll need everyone's statements, detailed accounts of everything that happened from when Crow first approached you to what went down here today. You'll have them. Delilah still had her gun on Crow, who knelt in the dirt with blood spreading from his leg wound. Owen, you need to look at this. She gestured to Crow's injury. Owen stared at her incredulously. You want me to treat him? After everything? I want you to keep him alive long enough to stand trial. He doesn't get to die out here, quick and easy. He faces justice, real justice. Her eyes were hard. Can you do that? Owen wanted to refuse, wanted to let Crow bleed out his payment for all the lives he'd destroyed. But he looked at Delilah's face and understood what she was really asking. She needed this. Needed to see the man who'd killed her brother face consequences that mattered. I can do it, Owen said quietly. He knelt beside Crow with his medical supplies, working to stop the bleeding from a man he'd rather see dead. Crow watched him with eyes full of hate and something that might have been respect. You surprise me, Dr. Mercer, Crow said through gritted teeth. I really thought you'd run when things got ugly. I did too, Owen admitted. Turns out I was wrong about myself. We both were. Crow winced as Owen tightened a bandage. For what it's worth, you would have made an excellent asset. You have the intelligence, the adaptability. If you'd been willing to compromise your principles, we could have accomplished great things together. Then I'm glad I'm a disappointment. Crow actually smiled at that. Fair enough. The The wagon train caught up to them 3 hours later, guided by signals from Lieutenant Barnes. Jacob Kane rode at the head, his face thunderous when he saw Crow and irons and the weapons crates laid open as evidence. "Someone want to explain what in hell happened here?" Delilah did, laying out the whole story with Lieutenant Barnes corroborating the details. Crow's recruitment network, the planned attacks, the dead marshals, the weapons smuggling operation that had been using wagon trains as cover for years. Kane's expression grew darker with each revelation. When Delilah finished, Kane turned to Owen. "You knew about this?" "Not all of it. All. Not until recently." "And you didn't think to bring it to me? Would you have believed me?" Owen met the wagon master's eyes. "A scared dentist making accusations against a beloved missionary? You would have thrown me off the train." Kane worked his jaw, then nodded grudgingly. "Probably. Doesn't make it right, but probably." He looked at Delilah. "And you, federal informant working undercover, you could have gotten everyone killed." "I saved everyone," Delilah corrected. "Crow was going to betray this train either way. At least now he's in custody and the weapons are in federal hands." Sarah Henderson pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around her husband, sobbing with relief. Their children clung to both parents, and Owen had to look away from the raw emotion of it. That night, the wagon train made camp in a defensible position, while Lieutenant Barnes and 2 deputy marshals he'd brought as backup guarded Crow and the evidence. The families gathered around fires, processing the reality that they'd been traveling with a criminal enterprise and had nearly been caught in its final act. Owen sat alone at the edge of the firelight, watching stars wheel overhead and trying to reconcile the man he'd been with the man he'd become. 3 weeks ago, he would have run, would have let Crow intimidate him into silence, would have found a way to justify staying safe while others suffered. But somewhere between Salvation Creek and this nameless canyon, something had changed. He'd found a line he couldn't cross, not without losing whatever made him worth saving. Delilah found him there, sitting down with a tired sigh. Her face was bruised, her arm bandaged, but she was smiling. "You did good today." "I froze up, couldn't shoot, couldn't fight. I was useless in the actual combat." "You stood up when it mattered most. That's not useless." She bumped his shoulder with hers. "You know what the difference is between a brave man and a coward?" "What?" "Nothing. They're both scared. The brave one just does it anyway." She pulled out her journal, the one she'd given him that morning, which felt like a lifetime ago. "You ready to hear the truth?" "About what?" "About why I really needed to be on this wagon train. About who my brother actually was." She took a breath. His name was Marcus Voss. He was 17, newly married, heading to the mining camps to make his fortune. But he was also a federal courier, carrying documents about a weapons smuggling operation to the territorial marshal. Documents that would have exposed Crow's entire network. Owen went still. Crow knew. Crow knew. He arranged the attack specifically to kill Marcus and destroy those documents. 23 people died as collateral damage to eliminate one target. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. "I've spent 3 years hunting him, following his pattern, gathering evidence, trying to build a case that would stick. And you, scared, incompetent you, helped me finish it. I'm sorry about your brother." "Me too, but at least now he can rest." She stood, offering him her hand. "Come on, Lieutenant Barnes wants our statements while everything's fresh, and then maybe we can talk about what happens next." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're still married, Owen. That was real, even if the reasons were lies. We need to figure out what we do about that." Owen took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. "One crisis at a time?" "One crisis at a time," she agreed. They walked back toward the camp together, this mismatched pair who'd stumbled into each other's lives and somehow managed to survive the collision. Behind them, the frontier stretched dark and infinite. Ahead, the fires of the wagon train burned against the night, small defiances against a wilderness that didn't care if they lived or died. But they had lived. Against odds, against fear, against men like Crow, who believed the weak existed only to be exploited. And somewhere in that survival, Owen Mercer had discovered something more valuable than all the gold in the mining camps. He'd discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the choice to act despite it. And that choice, made in a moment of crisis by a dentist who had no business being a hero, had changed everything. Crow was transported to the nearest federal garrison 3 days later, along with enough evidence to ensure he'd hang for his crimes. Pike was never found. The frontier had swallowed him whole, and the marshals decided one captured smuggler was worth more than a months-long manhunt for his partner. The wagon train continued toward the mining camps, lighter by one supply wagon and considerably wiser about the men they trusted. Tom Henderson insisted Owen ride up front with him for the rest of the journey, teaching him the skills every frontiersman needed. Danny and the other young recruits treated Owen with a respect that made him deeply uncomfortable, like he'd become something he wasn't sure he deserved to be. And Delilah stayed close, watching Owen with eyes that saw more than he wanted to reveal. They didn't talk about the marriage or what came next. There would be time for that when they reached their destination. For now, they rode side by side into an uncertain future, bound by shared trauma and a strange partnership that had started as deception and become something neither of them knew how to name. The weakest man on the wagon train had survived his first real test, but Owen suspected the frontier had more lessons to teach, and not all of them would be as clear-cut as good men against bad. The real question was whether the man he was becoming could handle what came next, and that was an answer only time would provide. The mining camps appeared on the horizon like a fever dream made of canvas and desperation. Owen stood at the front of the Henderson wagon, watching the sprawling chaos take shape through the dust. Hundreds of tents, rough-hewn buildings, and men moving with the frantic energy of people chasing something that probably didn't exist. "Welcome to Silver Ridge," Tom said, though his voice carried no enthusiasm. "Where fortunes are made and sanity goes to die." The wagon train descended into the valley, and with each passing mile, Owen felt the weight of what came next pressing down on him. For 6 weeks, he'd had a clear purpose: survive the journey, help the families, stop Crow. Now that journey was ending, and the question Delilah had asked 3 days ago hung between them like smoke. What happens next? They made camp on the outskirts of the mining settlement, where new arrivals clustered before dispersing into the chaos. Families began the process of separation, goodbye hugs, promises to stay in touch, addresses exchanged that might never be used. The Henderson children clung to Owen like he was family, and Sarah pressed a small cloth bundle into his hands. "It's not much," she said, tears streaming. "Just some jerky and bread, but Tom and I wanted you to have something to remember us by." "I'll remember you regardless," Owen said, his throat tight. "You took me in when I had nothing. That's not something you forget." Tom gripped his hand with calloused fingers. "You ever need anything, Dr. Mercer? Work, shelter, just someone to talk to, you find us. We'll be staking a claim about 10 miles northeast. You'll always have a place with our family." Owen watched them pack up their wagon for the final leg of their journey, feeling something crack in his chest. These people had become his anchor in a world that kept trying to drown him, and now they were leaving, heading toward their own uncertain future while he faced his. Delilah appeared at his shoulder as the Henderson wagon rolled away. "You gonna miss them?" "Already do." "That's the frontier. People come into your life like storms, change everything, then move on." She was quiet for a moment. "We should talk. About the marriage. About what we do now that the job's done." "I thought you might just disappear one night. Save us both the awkward conversation." "I considered it." She almost smiled. "But you deserve better than that. Come on, let's find somewhere quiet." They walked away from the camp, following a creek bed until the noise of the settlement faded to a distant murmur. Delilah sat on a fallen log, and Owen settled beside her, both of them staring at water that moved with no particular destination in mind. "I'm not actually a federal informant," Delilah said finally. "I mean, I was working with them, but it wasn't official. No badge, no authority. Just a woman who wanted justice and convinced some marshals I was worth the risk." "Why tell me now?" "Because you're owed the truth, all of it." She picked up a stone, turning it over in her hands. "My brother's death broke something in me. For 3 years I've been chasing Crow, building a case, living for revenge disguised as justice. But now that it's over, now that he's going to hang for what he did, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life." Owen understood that feeling better than he could articulate. "Join the club. I came west to escape being ordinary, and now I'm a dentist in a mining camp. That's about as ordinary as it gets. You saved lives, stopped criminals, stood up when everyone else was ready to break. She turned to face him. That's not ordinary, Owen. It was blind panic and dumb luck. It was courage. She reached out, touching his face with unexpected gentleness. And I think somewhere along the way I stopped pretending to be your wife and started actually caring about you, which complicates things. Owen's heart was hammering. How so? Because we got married for the wrong reasons, built this whole relationship on lies and necessity, and now I have to figure out if what I feel is real or just trauma bonding. She dropped her hand. You feel it too, don't you? This thing between us that shouldn't exist but does anyway? Yes, Owen admitted, and it terrifies me. Good, we're both terrified. That's honest, at least. She stood, brushing dirt from her pants. Here's what I'm thinking. We stay married for now, no point in complicated annulments when we don't know where this goes. We find you a place to set up your dental practice, see if you can actually make a living in this madness. And we give ourselves time to figure out what we are when we're not running for our lives. That's your plan. Just see what happens. You got a better one? Owen didn't. He stood facing her in the fading light. What if we try and it doesn't work? What if we're only good at surviving together, not actually living together? Then we'll know, and we'll move on. She met his eyes. But Owen, I think we owe it to ourselves to find out. We've earned that much. Before he could respond, voices erupted from the direction of the camp, angry, urgent, calling for the doctor. Owen and Delilah ran back to find chaos unfolding. Two miners had gotten into a dispute over claim boundaries that had escalated into violence. One was bleeding from a knife wound to the shoulder. The other had taken a bullet through the leg. Both were surrounded by friends who looked ready to restart the fight. Someone get the doc, a man was shouting. We got wounded here. Owen pushed through the crowd, his medical training overriding his fear. Move aside. Let me see them. The next hour was brutal work, digging out a bullet while the wounded miner screamed and threatened to kill everyone in sight, stitching a knife wound that had missed the major artery by inches, keeping two groups of angry men from turning a medical emergency into a massacre. Through it all, Delilah stood at Owen's shoulder, her hand on her gun, her presence enough to keep the violence from rekindling. When it was over and both men were bandaged and sedated with whiskey, an older miner with a gray beard approached Owen. You the dentist from the wagon train? I am. Name's Garrett. I run the claims office here. He glanced at the two wounded men. You just prevented what would have been a bloodbath. These two families have been feuding for weeks. If one of them had died tonight, we'd have had full-scale war. I was just doing my job. Your job saved lives and kept the peace. That's worth something in Silver Ridge. Garrett pulled out a piece of paper. There's a building on the main street. Used to be an assayer's office before the owner moved to better prospects in California. It's empty, decent condition. You want it for your practice, it's yours. Owen stared at the paper. I don't have money for rent. First month's free. After that, we'll work something out. Town needs a proper medical man, and you just proved you can handle the worst we've got to offer. Garrett handed him a key. Welcome to Silver Ridge, Dr. Mercer. Try not to get yourself killed. The building was better than Owen had any right to expect. 2 rooms, a potbelly stove that actually worked, windows that let in light, and enough space for his dental equipment, plus a small living area. Delilah helped him haul his trunks inside, both of them working in silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. You could stay here, Owen said as they set down the last trunk. With me, if you wanted. Is that an invitation or an obligation? It's me not wanting to sleep alone in a strange town after everything we've been through. He met her eyes. Stay, at least until we figure out what happens next. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but I'm taking the back room, and if you snore, I'm moving to a hotel. I don't snore. We'll see. They spent the next week transforming the empty building into something resembling a dental practice. Owen set up his chair, organized his instruments, created a space where frightened miners could sit while he pulled their aching teeth. Delilah, meanwhile, proved surprisingly adept at managing the business side, setting prices, keeping books, negotiating with suppliers who tried to charge Eastern rates for Western goods. "You're good at this," Owen observed one evening as she tallied receipts. "My father ran a mercantile in Missouri before he died. I grew up around ledgers and inventory." She didn't look up from her work. Turns out skills transfer, even when your life changes completely. Word spread quickly that Silver Ridge had a real dentist, and soon Owen's days filled with the steady stream of human misery that came from men who'd ignored dental health in favor of chasing gold. He pulled teeth, treated abscesses, occasionally performed minor surgery on injuries that had nothing to do with dentistry but desperately needed medical attention. The work was hard, the pay inconsistent, and the gratitude genuine. Men who couldn't afford his services brought food instead: fresh venison, eggs from hidden chicken coops, bread baked in Dutch ovens buried in coals. Owen discovered he was building something he'd never had in Philadelphia, a practice built on community rather than commerce. But Silver Ridge had another side, one that emerged after dark when the saloons filled and desperation turned to violence. In his second week, Owen was called to treat a man who'd been beaten nearly to death in a dispute over a card game. The victim died before morning, and Owen watched the marshal, a tired man named Cooper, arrest 3 men who probably wouldn't hang because witnesses were too scared to testify. "This is how it works here," Cooper explained to Owen afterward. "Justice only matters when enough people care. Most of the time, they just want to be left alone to chase their fortunes. That's not justice, that's chaos with a badge. Welcome to the frontier, Doc. You want civilization? Go back east." Cooper lit a cigarette, his face haggard in the lamplight. "But since you're here, I could use your help. Town's growing faster than we can control. Disputes escalating, violence increasing. Having a doctor who can testify about injuries, document evidence, that might make the difference between law and anarchy." Owen wanted to refuse, wanted to focus on his practice and stay out of Silver Ridge's darkness. But he looked at Cooper's face and saw the same exhausted determination he'd seen in Delilah when she was hunting crow. "What do you need me to do?" The arrangement was simple. Owen would document injuries on victims of violence, provide testimony when cases went to trial, and occasionally accompany Cooper on calls where medical expertise might prevent bloodshed. In exchange, Cooper would ensure Owen's practice stayed protected from the kind of claim jumping and intimidation that drove other businesses under. Delilah was furious when she found out. "You just committed to making yourself a target. Every criminal in this town now has a reason to want you silenced." "They had that reason the moment I started treating their victims," Owen countered. "At least this way, maybe we can actually stop some of them." "We?" She laughed bitterly. "There's no we in this, Owen. This was your decision made without consulting your supposed wife." "You're right. I should have asked. I'm sorry." The apology took the wind from her anger. She sat down hard on the examination chair. "I can't lose someone else to frontier violence. I can't watch another person I care about die because they thought principles mattered more than survival." "Then help me stay alive." Owen crouched in front of her. "You know this world better than I do. Teach me how to see threats coming, how to protect myself, how to be smart instead of just stubborn." She stared at him, frustration and fear warring in her expression. Finally, she sighed. "You're impossible." "I've been told that before." "Fine. But we do this my way. No heroics, no stupid risks. You see danger, you run. You hear threats. You tell Cooper, and you never, ever go anywhere alone after dark without me knowing where you are." Deal. The education began that night. Delilah taught Owen how to read a room, which men were dangerous, which were just drunk, which situations could be diffused, and which needed immediate retreat. She showed him where to sit in saloons for quickest exit, how to position himself in conversations to never have his back to the door, which alleys to avoid and which shortcuts were actually safe. "The frontier's about information," she explained one evening as they walked the main street. "Knowing who's allied with whom, which claims are disputed, where money's flowing. That's how you survive, not through courage or skill, but through understanding the patterns before they turn violent." Owen absorbed it all, adding this knowledge to everything Tom Henderson had taught him about practical survival. He was becoming something new, not quite a frontiersman, not quite the Philadelphia dentist he'd been. Something in between, forged by necessity and refined by experience. A month into their Silver Ridge life, The pattern Delilah had been tracking finally revealed itself. A mining operation called the Territorial Development Company had been buying up claims at prices that seemed generous until the sellers realized they'd been duped by fine print. Disputes were escalating, violence increasing, and the company's enforcers, led by a man named Silas Pike, were making it clear that resistance would be met with force. Owen froze when Delilah said the name. Pike? The same Pike who worked with Crow? The same. Apparently he didn't disappear into the frontier. He came here, found new employment, and is running the same scams just without the weapons smuggling. Her voice was ice. And this time I don't have federal backing or a case to build. Just suspicion and pattern recognition. So what do? We gather evidence, document the violence, build a case the same way we did with Crow. She met his eyes. But Owen, this is different. Pike knows who we are. If he realizes we're investigating him, he won't wait for a convenient moment. He'll just kill us. Owen thought about running, about closing the practice, taking Delilah, and finding somewhere safer to build their uncertain future. But he remembered the faces of the miners who'd lost their claims, the families being driven from land they'd legitimately purchased, the escalating violence that Marshall Cooper couldn't stop alone. We're staying, he said, but we're smart about it. The investigation took shape slowly, carefully. Owen documented injuries from company enforcers, recording details that would establish pattern and intent. Delilah interviewed displaced miners, gathering testimonies about fraudulent contracts and intimidation tactics. Cooper provided legal framework, building a case that might actually hold in territorial court. And through it all, Pike circled like a shark, getting closer with each passing week. The confrontation came 6 weeks into their investigation. Owen was closing his practice for the night when Pike walked through the door, massive, scarred, and radiating the casual menace of a man who knew violence intimately. Dr. Mercer. Pike's voice was the same gravel scrape Owen remembered from the wagon train. Been a while. Pike. Owen kept his hands visible, aware that Delilah was in the back room, hopefully armed. What brings you here? Heard you've been asking questions about the company, about certain business practices. Thought we should talk. I'm a dentist. I don't ask questions about business. Don't lie to me. Pike moved closer, and Owen fought the urge to retreat. You and that woman you married, you're building something. Files, testimonies, evidence. Thinking you can do to my employers what you did to Crow. Crow was a criminal. So am I. But I'm a smarter one. Pike's smile was terrifying. Here's how this works. You stop asking questions. You stop documenting injuries, you close your practice and leave Silver Ridge within 48 hours. Do that, and you get to live. And if we don't? Then the frontier claims 2 more casualties. Mining's dangerous work, Doc. Accidents happen all the time. Pike turned to leave, paused at the door. 48 hours, use them wisely. He was gone before Owen could respond, leaving behind a threat that felt like ice water in Owen's veins. Delilah emerged from the back room, her face pale but her gun steady. You heard? Every word. She set down the weapon carefully. He means it, Owen. Pike's not like Crow. He doesn't play games or make elaborate plans. He just kills people efficiently and moves on. So we run? That's the smart choice. Owen thought about Philadelphia, about all the times he'd chosen safety over risk, comfort over purpose. Thought about the man he'd been, afraid to be ordinary but even more afraid to be extraordinary. Thought about the journey that had brought him here, to this impossible place, standing in a dental practice he'd built with his own hands beside a woman he'd married under false pretenses and somehow grown to love. I'm tired of running, he said quietly. From Philadelphia, from who I was, from who I might become. If we leave now, we're just proving Pike right, that we're too scared to fight when it matters. Fighting Pike isn't brave, it's suicide. Maybe, or maybe it's the moment we stop letting men like him win because good people are too afraid to stand up. Owen met her eyes. You've been hunting these bastards for 3 years. Are you really ready to let Pike walk away because he threatened us? Delilah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but sad. You know what you're asking for? A chance to matter, to help people who can't help themselves, to prove that the frontier doesn't belong to whoever's most willing to kill. He took her hands. I'm not saying we're going to win. I'm saying we try anyway. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. You really have changed. The Owen Mercer I met in Salvation Creek would have been on the next stage out of here. That Owen Mercer died somewhere between the wagon train and here. I'm still figuring out who replaced him. Whoever it is, he's either very brave or completely insane. She squeezed his hands. All right, we stay. We finish what we started. But we do it smart. No confrontations, no heroics. We get the evidence to Cooper, let the law handle Pike. Agreed. They worked through the night, organizing their evidence into a coherent case. Testimonies from displaced miners, medical records showing pattern of violence, contracts with fraudulent terms buried in legal language. By dawn, they had enough to arrest Pike and his employers for fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. Cooper arrived at first light, reviewed the evidence with the grim satisfaction of a lawman who finally had the ammunition he needed. This is solid work. I can make arrests by noon. Pike threatened us, Delilah said. Gave us 48 hours to leave town. He'll know we went to you. Then I'll make sure he's in custody before he can act on that threat. Cooper gathered the files. You two stay here, stay armed, and don't open the door for anyone except me. Understand? They understood. They waited in the practice as morning turned to afternoon, both armed, both watching the street through the windows. Hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Then, just after 2, gunfire erupted from the direction of the company offices. Not a single shot, but a sustained barrage that spoke of serious resistance. Owen and Delilah ran to the window to see miners flooding into the street, some carrying weapons, others just watching as Marshal Cooper and his deputies exchanged fire with Pike's enforcers. It's a riot, Delilah said. The miners are taking advantage of the chaos to settle their own scores. More gunfire. A building caught fire. People were running, shouting, the fragile order of Silver Ridge dissolving into exactly the kind of violence Owen had been trying to prevent. We need to help, Owen said. Help how? We're not soldiers. No, but people are going to be hurt, wounded, dying. He was already grabbing his medical supplies. Cooper and his men can handle Pike. We need to handle the casualties. Delilah stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Then she grabbed her own weapon and nodded. All right, but we stay together, we stay low, and the moment it gets too dangerous, we retreat. Clear? Clear. They stepped into chaos. The main street had become a battlefield. Company men fighting miners, deputies trying to establish control, opportunists using the confusion to settle old grudges. Owen ran toward the first wounded man he saw, dragging him out of the line of fire, while Delilah covered their movement. For the next 3 hours, Owen worked in conditions that would have horrified his Philadelphia instructors. He treated gunshot wounds in the middle of the street, stitched knife injuries while bullets whined overhead, set broken bones caused by brawling. Delilah stayed at his side, her gun an argument that kept the violence from spilling over onto them. And slowly, impossibly, order began to reassert itself. Cooper and his deputies overwhelmed Pike's enforcers, arresting those who didn't flee. The miners, seeing that the company was broken, began helping rather than fighting. The fires were extinguished, the street cleared. Pike himself was found barricaded in the company office, wounded but defiant. He came out with his hands up, his face a mask of fury, when he saw Owen standing in the street. You did this? Pike snarled. You and that woman. All of this blood is on you. No, Owen said quietly. This blood is on you. You created this situation. We just documented it. Pike was taken away in irons, and Owen stood in the street surrounded by the wounded he'd saved and the chaos he'd helped end. His hands were covered in blood. His clothes were ruined. He was exhausted, terrified, and exhilarated all at once. Delilah appeared beside him, her face smudged with smoke, but her eyes clear. You all right? I have no idea. Owen looked at his shaking hands. Is it always like this? The violence and the aftermath and the question of whether you did the right thing? Always. Welcome to frontier justice, Dr. Mercer. She took his arm. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. They walked back to the practice through streets still littered with debris and consequences. Behind them, Silver Ridge was already beginning the process of recovery, picking up pieces, burying the dead, deciding what kind of town it wanted to be in the wake of violence. Owen had made his choice. He'd chosen to stay, to fight, to matter, even when mattering meant risking everything. And as he looked at Delilah walking beside him, this woman who'd started as a stranger became a partner and was slowly transforming into something he didn't have words for. He realized he'd found what he'd been searching for since leaving Philadelphia. Not safety, not comfort, not the absence of fear, but purpose. The bone-deep certainty that what he was doing mattered to people who needed him. The frontier had tested him, had broken him down and rebuilt him into someone unrecognizable from the nervous dentist who'd stepped off that stagecoach months ago. And somehow, impossibly, he'd survived the transformation. The question now was whether he could live with who he'd become. The answer came 3 days later, written in the faces of people Owen had saved. They arrived at his practice in a steady stream, miners with hats in hand, families bearing gifts they could barely afford, even a few of the company men who'd fought on the wrong side but had been treated fairly anyway. They came to say thank you, to pay what they could, to shake the hand of the dentist who'd run into gunfire to drag their brothers and fathers to safety. Owen stood in his doorway, overwhelmed by gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved, while Delilah watched from inside with an expression caught between amusement and something softer. "You're a hero now," she said when the last visitor had left. "How does it feel?" "Uncomfortable. I just did what needed doing." That's what heroes always say. She moved to the window, looking out at the street where workers were rebuilding the structures damaged in the riot. "The town council wants to meet with us tomorrow. Cooper says they're planning to make an official statement about what happened with Pike and the company." "An official statement?" Owen felt dread pooling in his stomach. "I don't want to be paraded around like some... Too late. You made choices that put you in the center of this mess. Now you deal with the consequences, good and bad." She turned to face him. "But there's something else. Lieutenant Barnes sent word from the territorial capital. Crow's trial is set for next month. They want us to testify." Owen sat down heavily. He'd been trying not to think about Crow, about the wagon train, about everything that had happened before Silver Ridge. But the past wasn't finished with him yet. "We have to go back," he said quietly. "We do. The prosecution needs our testimony to ensure Crow hangs. Without us, he might slip through on technicalities." Delilah's voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, clenched tight, knuckles white. "It means closing this practice for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. The town needs a doctor. The territory needs justice more." She crossed to him, kneeling so they were eye level. "Owen, this is it. The final chapter of the thing that brought us together. After this, after we testify and watch Crow face consequences, we're done. Free. We can decide what we want to be without the weight of his crimes hanging over us." "What if I already know what I want to be?" "Then tell me." Owen looked at her. This woman who'd manipulated him into marriage, dragged him into danger, and somehow become the center of his entire world. "I want to be someone who matters. Not famous, not wealthy. Just useful. Someone people can count on when everything falls apart." He took her hands. "And I want to do it with you. Not because we're married on paper, but because I can't imagine doing it with anyone else." Delilah's eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. Everything else is just details we figure out as we go." He squeezed her hands. "So what do you say? After Crow's trial, after we finished what your brother started, do you want to come back here with me? Build something real instead of running from what we've lost?" She didn't answer immediately, just pulled him close and held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. When she finally spoke, her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "Yes, but Owen, there's something I need to tell you first. About the marriage. About us." "What about us?" She pulled back, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made his breath catch. "When I married you in Salvation Creek, it was pure strategy. I needed cover, you needed help, and I told myself it was temporary. A means to an end." She took a shaking breath. "But somewhere between that fake wedding and standing in the street watching you save lives while bullets flew, I fell in love with you. The real kind. The terrifying kind that changes everything." Owen felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Delilah, let me finish. You need to know what you're signing up for. I'm not easy. I've got 3 years of grief and rage I'm still working through. I have nightmares about my brother. I wake up reaching for guns that aren't there, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder because I know how dangerous this world is. She gripped his hands harder. If you want simple, I'm not it. But if you want real, if you want someone who'll stand beside you when everything goes to hell, then I'm yours. If you'll have me. Owen didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he pulled her close and kissed her with all the desperate certainty of a man who'd finally found something worth keeping. She kissed him back, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. Two broken people who'd collided in chaos and somehow forged something whole. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Delilah laughed shakily. So I'm taking that as a yes? That's a yes to everything. The practice, the partnership, the terrifying real love that changes everything. Owen rested his forehead against hers. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Together? Together. The town council meeting the next day was exactly as uncomfortable as Owen had feared. Mayor Garrett stood before the assembled citizens of Silver Ridge and delivered a speech about courage, justice, and the kind of community they wanted to build. He praised Marshal Cooper's swift action, thanked the miners who'd helped restore order, and then turned his attention to Owen and Delilah. Dr. and Mrs. Mercer came to our town as strangers, Garrett said, his voice carrying across the packed room. They could have stayed safe, minded their own business, let corruption and violence run unchecked. Instead, they stood up. They gathered evidence, documented crimes, and helped bring a criminal enterprise to justice. And when chaos erupted, Dr. Mercer ran toward danger to save lives while others ran away. Owen felt his face burning as people applauded. Beside him, Delilah sat with perfect composure, though her hand found his under the table and squeezed tight. This town owes them a debt, Garrett continued, so the council has voted to deed the building housing Dr. Mercer's practice to him outright. No rent, no obligations. It's his, in recognition of service to Silver Ridge. More applause. Owen stood on shaking legs, managed to stammer out something about being honored and just doing his job, then sat down before he could embarrass himself further. Delilah leaned close. You're terrible at accepting praise. I'm terrible at a lot of things. This is just one more. After the meeting, Marshal Cooper pulled them aside. I meant what I said earlier about needing your help. Pike's arrest has created a power vacuum. Other operators are already moving in, testing boundaries. I need someone I can trust to document what's happening, provide medical testimony when cases go to trial. We're leaving for the territorial capital tomorrow, Delilah said. Crow's trial. We'll be gone at least 2 weeks. Cooper nodded. I expected as much. But when you come back, if you come back, the offer stands. This town needs people like you, people who care about something beyond gold and personal profit. We'll come back, Owen said with more certainty than he'd felt about anything in months. This is home now. The journey to the territorial capital took 5 days of hard riding. Owen and Delilah traveled with a federal escort, Lieutenant Barnes and 2 deputies who'd been assigned to ensure the prosecution's star witnesses arrived alive. The country they crossed was beautiful and hostile, a reminder that the frontier gave nothing freely. Owen used the time to prepare his testimony, reviewing notes and medical records until he could recite them in his sleep. Delilah grew quieter with each passing mile, the weight of what lay ahead settling over her like a shroud. You all right? Owen asked on the 4th night as they made camp. I'm about to watch the man who killed my brother hang. I should be celebrating. She stared into the fire. But all I feel is tired, like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that I don't know who I'll be when I finally put it down. You'll be yourself, just without the weight. What if myself isn't enough? What if revenge was the only thing holding me together? Owen moved to sit beside her. Then we'll figure out who you are now, same way I'm figuring out who I am. Together, remember? She leaned into him, and they sat in silence watching flames consume wood and turn it to ash. Tomorrow they'd reach the capital. Tomorrow the reckoning would begin. But tonight they had this: firelight and companionship, and the quiet promise that whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. The territorial capital was everything Silver Ridge wasn't: organized, civilized, with actual streets and buildings that looked permanent. Owen felt like a ghost haunting his own past as they rode through neighborhoods that could have been Philadelphia, with proper houses and shops, and people who'd never been shot at. The courthouse was an imposing stone structure that spoke of Eastern ambitions transplanted west. Inside it smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the musty certainty of men who believed law could tame wilderness. Crow was already there when Owen and Delilah entered the courtroom. He sat in chains, his polished exterior worn down by months in custody, but his eyes were still sharp and calculating. When he saw them, he smiled, that same warm, predatory smile that had convinced so many people he was harmless. "Dr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer." His voice carried across the room. "How good of you to come. I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk before this farce concludes." "We have nothing to say to you," Delilah said, her voice ice. "No, I suppose not. But I have things to say to you." Crow leaned forward as far as his chains allowed. "Do you know what the real crime is? Not the weapons, not the attacks, not even the deaths. It's the waste. All those people, your brother included, Miss Voss, they died for nothing. No great cause, no noble purpose, just because they were in the way of profit." "Shut your mouth," Delilah hissed. "Why? Because the truth hurts? Your brother died because he was carrying documents I couldn't allow to reach their destination. He was collateral damage. Meaningless. And you've spent 3 years seeking justice for someone who never mattered to anyone but you." Owen saw Delilah's hand move toward her hip, where her gun would have been if they hadn't been forced to surrender weapons before entering. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back before she could do something that would destroy everything they'd built. "He's trying to provoke you," Owen said quietly. "Don't give him the satisfaction." Delilah trembled with rage, but she let Owen pull her away from Crow's poisoned smile. They took seats as far from him as possible, and Owen kept his hand on hers throughout the proceedings, a physical reminder that she wasn't alone, that Crow's words were lies designed to wound. The trial lasted 3 days. Prosecutors presented evidence in meticulous detail: the weapons recovered from Crow's crates, testimonies from survivors of the wagon train attacks, financial records showing money flowing from raiders to Crow's accounts. Owen testified about the attack, about Crow's recruitment of the young men, about the moment when the minister's mask had slipped to reveal the predator beneath. Delilah's testimony was harder to watch. She spoke with controlled precision about her brother's death, about the investigation she'd conducted, about the pattern of violence that connected 4 separate attacks. But Owen could see what it cost her. Every word dragging up memories she'd tried to bury, every detail a fresh wound. Crow's defense attorney tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, a man who'd been in the wrong place at wrong time, who'd been manipulated by Pike into association with criminal elements. It was a weak argument, and the jury saw through it immediately. On the 3rd day, after barely an hour of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence was swift and absolute: death by hanging, to be carried out within the month. Crow showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He simply looked at Delilah with that same calculating smile and mouthed 2 words: "Worth it?" Owen felt Delilah's hand clench in his, felt the tremor that ran through her entire body. But she didn't look away, didn't give Crow the satisfaction of seeing her break. She just stared back until he was led away in chains, disappearing into the darkness that would soon claim him permanently. Outside the courthouse, Delilah finally allowed herself to collapse. Owen caught her, as her legs gave out, holding her while 3 years of grief and rage poured out in wrenching sobs that tore at his heart. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." He's still smiling. Even now, facing death, he's smiling like he won. He didn't win. He's going to hang, and you're going to live. That's not victory for him. It's defeat. Owen pulled back enough to see her face. "Your brother's death mattered, Delilah. It led to this, to justice, to preventing future attacks. Marcus didn't die for nothing. I want to believe that." "Then believe it, because it's true." They stayed in the Capitol for another week, providing additional testimony for cases being built against Pike and other members of Crow's network. Lieutenant Barnes kept them updated on the broader investigation: 17 arrests across 3 territories, millions in stolen goods recovered, and an entire criminal enterprise dismantled. "You two did this," Barnes said on their final day. "Without your testimony, without the evidence you gathered, Crow would still be operating. Families would still be dying. You saved lives by refusing to stay quiet." "We just did what was right," Owen said. "Most people don't. They see injustice and turn away because it's easier than fighting. You didn't. That matters more than you know." Barnes handed them a letter with an official seal. "The territorial governor wanted me to give you this. It's a formal commendation for service to the territory. Not worth much in practical terms, but it opens doors if you ever need official help." Owen pocketed the letter, knowing he'd probably never use it, but grateful nonetheless. They said their goodbyes to Barnes and the deputies who'd escorted them, then began the journey back to Silver Ridge. The ride back felt different, lighter somehow, like they were no longer carrying the weight of unfinished business. Delilah talked more, smiled easier, let herself relax in ways Owen had never seen before. At night they shared bedrolls instead of sleeping separately, and the intimacy felt earned rather than rushed. "What are you thinking about?" Delilah asked one evening as they watched sunset paint the sky in possible colors. "I'm thinking about how far I've come from Philadelphia. How the man I was would never recognize the man I am now." Owen turned to her. "I came west because I was afraid of being ordinary. Turns out, ordinary was never the problem. It was being useless. Being disconnected from anything that mattered. And now? Now I matter. To you, to Silver Ridge, to people I haven't even met yet who might need a dentist or a doctor or just someone who won't run when things get hard." He took her hand. "I found what I was looking for. It just looked nothing like I expected. Same here. I came hunting revenge and found a reason to live instead." She kissed him softly. "Thank you. For being stubborn enough to not let me push you away. For being brave when I needed you to be. For being exactly who you are. A frightened dentist who faints at the sight of his own blood? A good man in a world that desperately needs them." They reached Silver Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon to find the town transformed. New buildings had gone up in their absence. The main street had been graded and widened. Someone had even planted trees. Scrawny things that would probably die in the next drought, but the gesture spoke of hope and permanence. Marshal Cooper was waiting at Owen's practice with news. Pike escaped federal custody 3 days ago, killed 2 guards, and disappeared into the territory. Marshals are searching, but he knows this country too well. They might never find him. Owen felt cold dread settling in his stomach. "So he's still out there?" "He is, and he'll remember that you and Delilah helped destroy his operation." Cooper's face was grim. "I'm not trying to scare you, but you need to be aware. Pike's the kind who holds grudges." "We'll be careful," Delilah said, though her hand moved to her gun. Over the next weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt like building a life rather than just surviving. Owen's practice thrived, his reputation drawing patients from surrounding claims and settlements. Delilah took over this business side completely, managing finances and supplies with the efficiency she'd learned from her father. They hired help. A young woman named Clara, who'd lost her family to cholera and needed work, and a former miner named Jack, whose hands had been crushed in a cave-in, but who could still manage the practice's heavy labor. Together, they created something that felt like family. The Henderson family visited one Sunday, bringing news of their successful mining claim and introducing their newest member, a baby girl they'd named Hope. Sarah pressed the infant into Owen's arms with a smile. "You saved Michael's life. We wanted you to meet the sister he might not have had if you hadn't been there." Her eyes were wet with happy tears. "You're family to us, Dr. Mercer. Don't you ever forget that." Owen held the tiny life in his arms and felt something shift inside him, a recognition that he'd become part of something larger than himself. These people weren't just patients or acquaintances. They were his community, his purpose, his reason for staying when staying was hard. The attack came 3 months after Crow's execution. Owen was closing the practice late one evening when he heard the sound, a footstep that wasn't Delilah's, too heavy and deliberate. He turned to find Pike filling the doorway, a gun in his massive hand and murder in his eyes. "Hello, Doc. We have unfinished business." Owen's mind raced through options. Delilah was at the general store. His own gun was in the back room, too far to reach. He was alone with a killer who had every reason to want him dead. Pike, I heard you escaped. And I heard you testified against Crow. Watched him hang because you couldn't mind your own business. Pike moved closer, the gun never wavering. You cost me a fortune, Doc. Destroyed my operation, got my employer executed. Now I'm going to return the favor. Killing me won't bring back what you lost. No, but it'll make me feel better. Pike's finger tightened on the trigger. Any last words? Owen thought about running, about begging, about all the ways this could end badly. Then he thought about the man he'd become, the one who'd stood up to Crow, who'd run into gunfire to save lives, who'd chosen to matter even when mattering was dangerous. You're right that I cost you a fortune, Owen said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. But you lost it because you were stupid enough to believe Crow's operation could last. You built everything on lies and violence, and that always collapses eventually. I just helped it happen sooner. Pike's eyes narrowed. Bold words from a man about to die. Maybe, but I'm not afraid of you anymore, Pike. I've seen what you are, a bully who mistakes cruelty for strength. You think killing me proves something? It just proves you're exactly what I always thought you were. A coward who only feels powerful when he's got a gun pointed at someone weaker. For a moment, Owen thought he'd miscalculated. Pike's face twisted with rage, and his fingers started to squeeze the trigger. Then a voice came from the doorway behind him. Drop the gun, Pike. Now. Delilah stood there with her rifle aimed steady at Pike's back. Beside her was Marshal Cooper with his deputies, all armed and ready. Pike froze, calculating odds that weren't in his favor. It's over, Cooper said. You're surrounded. Put the gun down, and maybe you live through this. Pike's laugh was bitter. You think I'm stupid enough to surrender? I know what happens to men like me in federal custody. Crow had the right idea. Go out on your own terms. He started to turn, bringing his gun around toward Delilah. 3 shots rang out simultaneously, Cooper's, Delilah's, and one of the deputies. Pike dropped, the gun clattering from his hand, blood spreading across the practice floor. Owen moved immediately into doctor mode, dropping beside the dying man to check for a pulse he already knew wouldn't be there. Pike's eyes found his, and for a moment something like respect flickered in them. You got guts, Doc, Pike gasped. More than I thought. Save your strength. For what? I'm done. Blood bubbled at Pike's lips. Tell you something, though. You were right. About Crow. About all of it. Built on lies. Always collapses. He died before he could say more, his eyes going vacant as life left him. Owen sat back on his heels, looking at the blood on his hands and the body on his floor, and felt nothing but tired relief. Delilah pulled him up, checking him over for injuries with frantic hands. Are you hurt? Did he touch you? I'm fine, he was about to shoot, but then you... Owen pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Thank you. For the second time, you saved my life. Third, actually. But who's counting? She held him tight, and Owen felt her trembling despite her controlled exterior. I thought I was too late. I saw him through the window, saw the gun, and I thought, but you weren't. You were exactly on time. Owen pulled back enough to see her face. How did you know to bring Cooper? I didn't. I just had a feeling something was wrong, so I went to get backup before coming to check on you. She laughed shakily. Turns out, 3 years of hunting criminals teaches you to trust your instincts. Cooper and his deputies removed Pike's body and took statements. The marshal looked at Owen with new respect. You talk back to an armed killer? That's either brave or insane. Little of both, probably. Owen surveyed the blood on his floor with weary resignation. This is going to take forever to clean. We'll help, Clara said from the doorway, where she and Jack had appeared with cleaning supplies. This is our practice, too. They worked through the night, scrubbing away the evidence of violence until the practice looked normal again. By dawn, the only signs of what had happened were the memories and a new lock on the door that Cooper personally installed. This is the frontier, Cooper said as he finished. Violence finds everyone eventually. The question is whether you let it break you or make you stronger. He looked at Owen seriously. You could have died tonight. Still willing to stay? Still think Silver Ridge is worth it? Owen thought about Philadelphia, about the safe life he could have had. Then he thought about Michael Henderson's fever breaking, about the miners whose lives he'd saved during the riot, about the community he'd helped build and the woman he loved who was currently asleep on his examination table because she'd refused to leave him alone after the trauma. "I'm staying," Owen said. "This is home." The months that followed brought a kind of peace Owen had never expected to find. The practice grew, the town stabilized, and slowly the story of the dentist who'd faced down a killer became the kind of legend the frontier loved. Owen hated the attention, but accepted it as the price of mattering. He treated patients, documented evidence for Marshall Cooper, and occasionally traveled to nearby settlements to provide medical care where none existed. Delilah managed the business, handled the difficult personalities, and slowly let herself heal from the wounds her brother's death had left. They remarried on a Sunday afternoon 6 months after Pike's death. Not a hasty ceremony performed by a drunk judge, but a real wedding with Tom Henderson standing up as Owen's best man and Clara serving as Delilah's maid of honor. Half the town attended, and the celebration lasted well into the night. "How does it feel?" Delilah asked as they danced under stars that felt close enough to touch. "Being married for real this time?" "Terrifying and perfect in equal measure." Owen spun her carefully, still not entirely comfortable with frontier dancing. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for the other boot to drop." "The other boot already dropped. Several times. We survived it." She rested her head on his shoulder. "This is the good part, Owen. The part where we get to just live without constantly running or fighting or barely surviving. We've earned it." "Have we?" "Sometimes I feel like I stumbled into this life by accident." "There are no accidents, just choices and consequences and occasionally dumb luck." She pulled back to look at him. "You chose to come west. Chose to help me. Chose to stay when staying was dangerous. All of that led here. To us. To this." Owen looked around at the celebration, miners dancing with their families, children running wild, Marshall Cooper sharing drinks with the mayor while Clara and Jack argued good-naturedly about something inconsequential. This impossible community built on hope and stubbornness, and the desperate belief that the frontier could be tamed into something worth having. "I love you," he said, the words still feeling new and significant despite how many times he'd said them. "For dragging me into this chaos. For seeing something in me I didn't know was there. For being exactly who you are. I love you too, for being brave when it terrified you, for staying when leaving made more sense, for becoming the kind of man the frontier needs." She kissed him softly. "We're going to be all right, Owen Mercer. More than all right. We're going to be happy." And against all odds, against every expectation Owen had carried from Philadelphia, she was right. The years that followed brought the normal challenges of frontier life: harsh winters, economic downturns, occasional violence that required Owen's medical skills and Delilah's strategic thinking. But they faced it together, building something that lasted not because it was easy, but because they'd learned how to be strong in their brokenness. The practice expanded. Owen trained apprentices, taught basic medical skills to people in outlying settlements, and slowly became the kind of doctor the territory desperately needed. Delilah opened a second business, a supply store that competed fairly and drove out the predatory pricing that had plagued Silver Ridge for years. They had children, 3 daughters who inherited their mother's fierce intelligence and their father's stubborn kindness. Owen taught them to think critically, to help those weaker than themselves, to never mistake violence for strength. Delilah taught them to shoot, to read people, to survive in a world that didn't always protect women. The Henderson family became extended family, their children growing up alongside Owen and Delilah's. The bonds formed on that wagon train lasting across decades. Other families from the train stayed in contact, the shared experience of surviving Crow's conspiracy creating connections that transcended normal friendship. Silver Ridge grew into a real town, with schools and churches and businesses that lasted. Marshall Cooper eventually retired, and the town council offered Owen the position. He declined, preferring to remain a doctor, but he recommended someone who proved excellent at maintaining the fragile order frontier communities required. Lieutenant Barnes visited occasionally, always bringing news of the broader territory and updates on the criminal networks they'd helped dismantle. The weapons smuggling operation Crow had built never recovered, and Barnes credited Owen and Delilah's testimony as the turning point that made territorial law enforcement viable. And sometimes, late at night when his daughters were asleep and the practice was quiet, Owen would stand in his doorway looking at the town he'd helped build and marvel at the distance between who he'd been and who he'd become. The frightened dentist from Philadelphia had died somewhere on that wagon train. The man who'd replaced him was scarred, tested, and fundamentally changed by everything the frontier had thrown at him. But he was also useful, connected, part of something that mattered. Delilah found him there one evening, slipping her arms around him from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "How far I've come. How much I've changed." "Regrets?" Owen thought about his mother's tears, his father's disappointment, his former fiancée's predictions of failure. Thought about the safety he'd abandoned and the certainty he'd traded for chaos. "None," he said honestly. "Every choice led here. To you, to our family, to this life. I wouldn't change any of it. Not even the parts where you almost died? Especially not those. They taught me who I really was underneath the fear." He turned in her arms. "Thank you. For forcing me to be brave when I wanted to be comfortable. For seeing potential I didn't know I had. For being exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know I needed it." "You did that yourself, Owen. I just gave you the push." She smiled, that fierce expression he'd fallen in love with. "You were always brave. You just needed the frontier to show you." They stood together in the doorway of the life they'd built, watching Silver Ridge settle into evening. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing music. Closer by, their daughters laughed at something only children found funny. And above them, stars wheeled through an endless sky that had witnessed every moment of Owen Mercer's transformation. He'd come west to escape being ordinary and discovered that ordinary was the wrong enemy. The real challenge was becoming extraordinary in the ways that mattered, not through violence or wealth or frontier legend, but through steady service to people who needed him. The weakest man on the wagon train had survived through wit, stubbornness, and the desperate refusal to let fear make his choices. He'd faced down criminals, survived ambushes, built a practice from nothing, and earned the respect of a community that had every reason to reject him. And he'd done it not by becoming someone else, but by discovering who he'd always been underneath the anxiety and doubt. A healer, a husband, a father, a man who mattered because he chose to matter, even when that choice was terrifying. The frontier had tested him and found him worthy. Not because he was the fastest gun or the bravest fighter, but because when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance and choices had to be made, he'd chosen courage over comfort. And that, Owen had learned, was the only kind of heroism that actually counted. Years later, when his daughters asked about his journey west, Owen would tell them the truth. Not a sanitized legend, but the real story of a frightened man who stumbled into greatness through necessity and stayed there through choice. He'd tell them about Delilah's deception and his own cowardice, about Crow's evil and Pike's violence, about all the moments when giving up would have been easier than continuing. But he'd also tell them about Tom Henderson's quiet kindness, about Sarah's gratitude, about Marshall Cooper's integrity and Lieutenant Barnes's dedication. He'd tell them about the good people who'd helped him become worthy of their trust. And when his daughters asked if he'd do it all again, knowing what it would cost, Owen would look at Delilah and smile. "Every single time," he'd say. "Because some things are worth the price, worth the fear, worth becoming someone you never thought you could be." "Like what?" his youngest would ask. "Like home," Owen would answer, looking around at the life he'd built from nothing. "Like family. Like mattering to people who matter to you. Like love that survives everything the world throws at it." And Delilah would take his hand and squeeze it gently, that simple gesture containing everything they'd survived and built and become together. The story of Owen Mercer, the dentist who'd come west with dreams of opportunity and found something far better, would become part of Silver Ridge's history. Not the loudest legend or the most dramatic tale, but a steady story of transformation that inspired others who felt too weak or too scared or too ordinary to matter. Because the frontier didn't just belong to gunslingers and outlaws. It also belonged to people brave enough to stay when staying was hard. To healers who ran toward danger instead of away. To couples who built love from lies and made it real through shared struggle. The West had room for all kinds of heroes. Even dentists from Philadelphia who'd never wanted to be heroes at all. Owen Mercer had come west looking for opportunity and found purpose, had married a stranger and discovered love, had confronted his own weakness and learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the choice to act despite it. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The sun set on Silver Ridge, painting the sky in colors that still took Owen's breath away after all these years. Somewhere in the practice, his instruments waited for tomorrow's patients. Somewhere in town, people went about their lives knowing they had a doctor they could trust. And somewhere in his heart, the frightened boy from Philadelphia finally rested, replaced by the man he'd been meant to become all along. The frontier had changed Owen Mercer, had broken him down and rebuilt him into something stronger, more useful, more real. And he'd changed the frontier right back. One pulled tooth, one saved life, one stubborn choice at a time. It wasn't the story he'd expected when he boarded that stagecoach months ago, but it was the story he'd earned, moment by terrifying moment, until the man he'd become finally matched the man he'd always wanted to be. And that was worth every mile, every scar, every moment of fear. That was worth everything.